"Pack your bags, old lady." Jessica said it with a laugh, leaning against the kitchen island like she was queen of the house my money had helped buy. I stood there gripping my coffee mug so hard my hand shook, while my son Ryan stared at the floor like the tiles had suddenly become more important than his own mother. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not because of her cruelty, but because of his silence. I had buried my husband, sold my home, and trusted my only son to give me a place in his life. I never imagined I was walking straight into a betrayal that would cost them everything. If this opening touched something in you, take a moment to like and subscribe. And please tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own family treated you that way? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. 2 years before Jessica laughed in my face and told me to pack my bags, I was the kind of woman who still believed grief made families gentler. My name is Bonnie Peterson. I was 68 years old when I moved to North Carolina, and for 41 years before that, I had been Daniel Peterson's wife. People talk about losing a husband as if it is one clean moment, one hospital room, one final breath, one funeral. But that is not how it happens. Not really. Losing Daniel came in waves. It came when I signed papers with a hand that did not feel like mine. It came when I found his reading glasses still folded on the nightstand. It came when I reached for him in the dark 3 weeks after the funeral and touched nothing but cold sheets. Daniel had been the steady center of my life since I was 26 years old. He was not flashy. He was not loud. He was the kind of man who fixed broken drawer tracks without being asked, who remembered every anniversary, and who could make a Sunday morning feel sacred with nothing more than coffee, bacon, and old jazz playing softly from the kitchen. Radio. We had made a good life together in Florida. Not a glamorous life, but a stable one. He worked for years as a commercial insurance adjuster, and I spent most of my adult life first raising our son Ryan and later working part-time at a church office and then at a library. We were careful with money. Daniel believed in savings and backups, in never trusting good times to last forever. He used to say comfort is a blessing, Bonnie, but security is a discipline. At the time, I used to roll my eyes and tease him for sounding like a banker in a polo shirt. After he died, I repeated those words to myself more times than I care to admit. The condo in Sarasota suddenly felt too quiet without him. Every room held a memory I wanted and could not bear. I started sleeping with the television on just to fill the silence. I stopped cooking proper meals. Sometimes I would walk through the grocery store and put things in my cart that Daniel liked, wheat crackers, strawberry jam, smoked turkey, then stand there staring at them until I remembered he was gone. That was when Ryan started calling more often. At first it touched me deeply. My son had always been loving in his own way, though adulthood had made him busier and more distracted. He lived outside Asheville, North Carolina with his wife Jessica. They had no children yet, which Jessica always explained with polished little sighs about timing careers and wanting to build the right foundation first. Ryan called every other evening for a while, sometimes every day. He asked whether I had eaten. He told me not to sit alone too much. He reminded me to lock the doors at night the same way I had reminded him 1,000 times when he was 17 and careless. Sometimes he would say, "Mom, Dad would want me looking after you." That always brought tears to my eyes. One Sunday in late October, about 4 months after Daniel passed, Ryan flew down for the weekend. He took me to lunch at a seafood place Daniel and I used to love. I remember sitting across from him, watching him unfold his napkin, noticing how much he looked like his father around the mouth when he was serious. "Mom," he said gently, "you can't stay down here all alone forever." I looked out at the water. "I'm managing." "You're surviving," he said. "That's not the same thing." I did not answer because I knew he was partly right. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "Come be near us," he said. "Come to North Carolina. We can find a place with enough room for all of us. You'd have your own space, your own privacy, but you wouldn't be alone. We'd be there. You'd be family, not a visitor." There are moments in life when loneliness dresses itself up as wisdom. That day, I thought I was making a thoughtful, brave decision. Looking back, I can see I was simply tired of eating dinner by myself. I asked about Jessica, though not directly. I said, "That's a big adjustment for newly married people." Ryan smiled. "Jess actually suggested it before I did. That surprised me." Jessica and I had always been cordial, but not deeply close. She was polished, ambitious, sharp, in a way that made me choose my words carefully around her. Not rude exactly, just difficult to read. but over the next few weeks she made a point of calling me too. "Bonnie, we would love to have you closer," she said in her warm, practiced voice. "Family should show up for each other, especially now." Another time she said, "You don't need to be rattling around alone in that condo. We can create something beautiful together. Create something beautiful together." At the time, that sounded almost comforting. Ryan and Jessica came down again in December, and the three of us sat at my dining table with coffee and legal pads, talking about options. Ryan said the housing market near them was competitive, but if we pooled resources, we could buy something spacious. Jessica pulled up listings on her tablet, tidy brick houses, with finished basements, wide porches, guest suites, and wooded backyards. "We're not talking about you moving in and feeling like an extra," she said. "That would be terrible. We're talking about a real shared home." Shared. It is a dangerous word when spoken by the wrong people. At the time, all I heard was belonging. My condo had appreciated nicely over the years. Daniel and I also had investment accounts, modest but solid, and a life insurance policy that gave me a cushion after his death. I was not wealthy, but I was secure. For the first time in my life, I had enough not to panic, enough to live simply, comfortably, and with dignity. Ryan knew that. Of course he knew that. He was my son. The plan, as they presented it, sounded reasonable. I would sell the condo in Florida. Ryan and Jessica would sell their smaller townhouse outside Asheville. Together with my contribution forming a substantial part of the down payment, we would purchase a larger home where all three of us could live. I would have a first-floor suite. They would have the upstairs. Shared kitchen, shared main living spaces, separate bedrooms, separate bathrooms, independence with closeness, privacy with family. Everything was wrapped in the language of care. Ryan said, "Mom, this way your money works for you. You won't be throwing it away on some retirement place that smells like soup and sadness." Jessica laughed lightly. "And this gives you investment upside too. A nice home in a good area. It makes sense all around." What they were really offering me, though, I did not understand it then, was not just a new house. They were offering me a story in which I was still needed, a story in which I had not become one of those women people speak about softly after church, saying things like, "Her husband passed and now she's all alone." A story in which my life was not shrinking but rearranging itself into something still warm. I wanted that story so badly I never stopped to ask who was writing it. I put my condo on the market in early spring. The day the for sale sign went up, I sat in my car in the driveway and cried until my chest hurt. Not because I had changed my mind, but because every leaving carries a funeral inside it. The condo sold quickly. Florida was still hot and there was a bidding war I barely understood. After closing costs, I cleared more than I expected. Ryan sounded thrilled. Jessica sounded relieved in a way I mistook for excitement. "That gives us so much flexibility," she said. "This is really happening." I moved into a short-term furnished rental for 6 weeks while they finalized things in North Carolina. During that time, boxes became my whole world. I sorted dishes, framed photos, tax records, winter coats I had not worn in years, and Daniel's old watches. I gave away things I no longer needed and kept things I could not explain keeping. A chipped ceramic bowl, a set of yellow napkins, the navy sweater Daniel wore on our last anniversary trip. Grief makes archivists of us. When Ryan called with the news that they had found the house, he sounded happier than I had heard him in months. "It's perfect, Mom," he said. "Big kitchen, gorgeous yard, quiet street, and there's a suite downstairs that's basically made for you." "For me," I said, smiling despite myself. "For you," he said. Jessica got on the phone and added, "It really feels like a fresh start, Bonnie. I can see us doing holidays there, Sunday dinners, maybe even hosting family." I stood in that little furnished rental surrounded by half-packed boxes and borrowed lamps and let myself believe them. I imagined Thanksgiving casseroles and Christmas music. I imagined sitting on a porch swing with sweet tea while Ryan grilled in the yard. I imagined laughter drifting through windows. I imagined Daniel wherever he was feeling relieved that I would not be alone. The closing happened while I was still in a fog of moving logistics and widow's exhaustion. Ryan handled many of the practical details. Jessica handled others. They framed it as helping me, protecting me from stress. I was grateful for it. I signed what I was told needed signing. I skimmed, asked a few questions, nodded through the rest. At the time, I thought trust was a sign of family. I did not know then that trust in the wrong hands becomes a weapon long before it becomes a wound. Still, when I first pulled into the driveway of that big North Carolina house and saw Ryan waiting at the front door with his arms open, I felt something close to hope. I had no idea I was carrying my money, my grief, and my good faith straight into the place where all three would be used against me. The first few weeks in that house were so pleasant, I have often gone back over them in my mind, wondering whether I was blind or whether Ryan and Jessica were simply better actors than I ever gave them credit for. Maybe it was both. The house itself was beautiful in the way newer Southern homes often are, large without being grand, tasteful without being memorable. It sat on a quiet street outside Asheville in a neighborhood full of maple trees, stone mailboxes, and women who waved from their porches in the evening. The front of the house had soft gray siding, white trim, and a wide covered porch with enough space for rocking chairs. Jessica said that was what sold her on it. "It feels welcoming," she told me on the day I moved in. At the time, I believed her. My suite was on the first floor, just off the hallway near the back of the house. It had a decent-sized bedroom, a private bathroom, and a little sitting area near a window that looked out over the backyard. Ryan had even helped arrange my furniture so the room would feel familiar. Daniel's old leather chair sat by the window. My blue quilt lay neatly across the bed. A framed photo of the three of us at the beach taken when Ryan was 12 rested on the dresser. When I first walked into that room, I put my hand over my heart. "It looks like me," I said softly. Ryan smiled. That was the goal. Jessica, standing in the doorway with her arms folded loosely, added, "We wanted you to feel at home, Bonnie, not like you were staying in someone else's space." That sentence stayed with me later, long after everything had changed. At the beginning, they were careful, thoughtful even. Jessica asked whether I preferred almond milk or regular. Ryan programmed my favorite local news station into the television in my room. They invited me to dinner every night, even when I offered to eat on my own. On my first Sunday there, Jessica arranged fresh flowers in a cream-colored pitcher and set out cloth napkins for lunch, as if we were the kind of family that had always known how to be close. There were moments, small, ordinary moments, when I truly let myself relax. One evening, Ryan grilled chicken outside while I made a potato salad in the kitchen, and Jessica set the patio table with citronella candles. The weather was mild, and the trees behind the house glowed gold in the falling light. Ryan opened a beer and leaned against the railing, telling a story about a difficult client at work. Jessica laughed in just the right places. I remember sitting there with my plate in my lap, thinking, maybe this was the right decision. Maybe grief had not ruined everything. Maybe family could still gather around a table and mean it. That is the thing about a false peace. It does not always feel false while you are inside it. For the first 2 weeks, I was treated less like a burden than like an honored guest. Jessica insisted on carrying in my laundry basket once when she found me struggling with a fitted sheet. Ryan drove me to a doctor's appointment because he was heading that way anyway. When neighbors stopped by with banana bread or introductions, Jessica always said, "This is Bonnie Ryan's mom. She lives with us now and we're so happy she's here." Lives with us now. Again, it sounded affectionate then. But if kindness is real, it settles naturally. It does not strain under its own weight. Somewhere around the 3rd week, I began to notice little things that did not fit the warm picture I had been given. The first was so small it seemed ridiculous to even mention to myself. Jessica and I were standing in the upstairs hallway one afternoon while she showed me where she kept extra towels and guest linens. I had come up looking for a blanket because the air conditioning had made my room cold the night before. She pointed toward the primary bedroom and said, "This is our side of the house, so I usually keep the nicer sets in the hall closet up here. Our side of the house." I smiled and nodded as if nothing about that phrasing had landed strangely. Then with equal casualness, she said, "There are plenty of extras for the guest area downstairs." The guest area. I said nothing. What could I say? That one word had stung, that after contributing such a large portion of the money that bought the home, I had not expected to hear my private suite described the way a hotel might describe a side wing. It seemed petty to react. So I did what women of my generation have done too often for too long. I swallowed the discomfort and called it grace. Still, once you notice one crack, others begin to show. Jessica had very firm ideas about the house. At first, I thought that was natural. Young wives often do. She liked things neat, coordinated, and modern. She wanted open counters, neutral accents, and visual calm, which mostly meant putting away anything she thought made the house feel too old, too cluttered, or too personal. One morning, I came into the living room and found that she had removed the framed family photos from the side table by the sofa. In their place sat a pair of white ceramic vases and a stack of design books nobody in that house was ever going to read. I looked around confused. "Did you move the pictures?" Jessica glanced up from her laptop at the breakfast bar. "Oh yes, I put them in the cabinet for now." It was starting to feel a little crowded in there. A little crowded. There had been 4 framed photographs. I opened the cabinet later and found them stacked face to face beside a fondue set and an unused serving tray. It should not have hurt as much as it did. But grief makes symbols out of objects. Those pictures were not decor to me. They were proof that my life had happened. Ryan noticed none of this. Or pretended not to. When I mentioned it lightly that evening, I was looking for the beach picture and saw Jessica had rearranged a bit. He gave me the distracted smile busy adult children use when they have already decided their mother is overreacting. "Jess is just trying to make everything flow better, Mom," he said. "She's good at that stuff." "I'm sure she is," I replied. That became the rhythm of it. "Jessica changed," Ryan explained. Jessica moved. Ryan softened it. Jessica took up space. Ryan asked me not to read into things. There were other examples. The pantry shelves were reorganized and suddenly my tea crackers and cereal were all moved to the lowest rack to keep the daily items together, though the things most used by Ryan and Jessica stayed at eye level. A small writing desk I had placed near the den window disappeared into the garage because Jessica said the corner needed to breathe. The throw blanket Daniel and I had kept over the back of the couch for years vanished from the family room and reappeared folded in a linen bin upstairs. None of it was dramatic enough to justify a confrontation. That was the brilliance of it. Every change came wrapped in reason, in efficiency, in taste, in practicality, and yet the message underneath each change was always the same. This house is being defined without you. I began to feel uncertain in my own movements. I would stand in the kitchen and hesitate before opening a drawer as if I should ask permission in a home I had helped buy. I started taking my breakfast later because Jessica seemed to prefer the kitchen to herself in the mornings. If I sat in the den while she was working on her laptop, I could feel her energy shift, not hostile exactly, but interrupted. Like I had walked into a room already assigned its purpose and found there was no natural place for me in it. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking to a friend on the back patio while I was inside rinsing berries at the sink. It was not a private conversation in the way intimate things are private. It was private in the way careless things are private, the way people talk when they assume no one worth censoring themselves for is listening. She laughed and said, "It's actually going pretty well. Better than I thought." A pause. Then, "No, she's easy, honestly. Emotional but easy." I went still. Another pause. Then Jessica again, her voice lighter, amused. "I mean, she still thinks of it as shared." That helps. Shared. Something in my chest tightened. I could not hear the rest clearly because she lowered her voice, but the shape of that sentence stayed with me long after the words faded. She still thinks of it as shared. That evening at dinner, Ryan talked cheerfully about lawn care estimates while Jessica passed the green beans and asked whether I preferred the guest bath towels washed separately because of my skin sensitivity. The guest bath towels. I looked at her across the table. Her face was open, composed, almost sweet. For the first time, I had the oddest sensation that I was not sitting with family at all. I was sitting inside an arrangement that had been explained to me one way and understood by someone else in another. Even then, I did not yet think danger. Not truly. Hurt, yes. Unease, certainly. But not danger. I told myself, adjustment takes time. I told myself young couples have their own habits. I told myself grief had made me too tender, too watchful, too likely to assign meaning where there was none. But late at night, lying in bed in the room that was beginning to feel less like mine than it had on the first day, I would replay Jessica's words in my mind. Our side of the house, guest area. She still thinks of it as shared. And for the first time since I had arrived in North Carolina, hope began to loosen its grip on me. Not all at once. Not enough to make me act. Just enough to make me wonder whether I had misunderstood what kind of home I had moved into and what kind of role they had really imagined for me once I got there. By the second month, the house no longer felt like a place I was settling into. It felt like a place I was being edited out of. The changes were still small enough on the surface to be explained away. That was what made them so effective. Jessica never stormed into a room and announced that my presence bothered her. She did something far more sophisticated than that. She made each piece of my life seem slightly inconvenient, slightly outdated, slightly in the way. And because every single act was so easy to defend on its own, I began to understand how a person could be erased without anyone ever admitting that was the plan. It started with Daniel's chair. The leather recliner by my window had become my favorite spot in the house. I drank my tea there in the morning and read there in the evenings. The chair still held the shape of a life that had mattered to me. When I sank into it, I could almost imagine Daniel in the next room, humming to himself, asking whether I had seen the remote. One Tuesday afternoon, I came back from a walk around the neighborhood and found the chair gone. In its place stood a narrow cream accent chair with wooden legs and a stiff little pillow printed with blue leaves. I stopped in the doorway and stared. For a moment, I honestly thought I had stepped into the wrong room. Then Jessica's voice floated in from the hall. "Oh good, you're back. I meant to tell you I had the old recliner moved to the garage." I turned slowly. The garage. She gave me that composed, bright smile that never reached her eyes. It was overwhelming, the room, Bonnie. "This feels lighter, don't you think?" I looked past her as if the old chair might somehow reappear if I refused to accept what I was seeing. That was Daniel's chair. "I know," she said, still smiling. But it was also cracked, dark, and honestly a little too bulky for the space. I didn't throw it out. I just moved it. Just moved it. As if grief were a lamp and not a living thing. I kept my voice steady. "I would have liked you to ask me first." Jessica tilted her head with a softness that felt rehearsed. "Of course. I'm sorry if that upset you. I was just trying to make the room more comfortable. Comfortable for whom I wanted to ask. But Ryan came home not long after, and when I told him what had happened, he rubbed the back of his neck and gave me the same weary half-smile I had begun to dread. "Mom Jess probably thought she was helping," he said. "You know how she gets when she's focused on the house." "The house," I repeated. He missed the emphasis completely. "Look, if you want the chair back, I'm sure we can bring it in later. Later." Everything that mattered to me had begun being placed into that vague future where it could be acknowledged without ever being restored. I let it go then, but something shifted in me. I began noticing the pattern more clearly because once you stop explaining away pain, it starts introducing itself honestly. A week later, I opened the hallway closet looking for extra blankets and found 3 boxes marked "Donate" in thick black marker. One of them held books Daniel and I had collected over decades, biographies, cookbooks, old travel guides with my notes in the margins. Another contained framed prints that had hung in my Florida condo. The third held serving dishes I had brought from Sarasota, including the white casserole dish I used every Thanksgiving. I stood there with my hand on the closet door, feeling heat rise behind my eyes. Jessica came around the corner carrying a basket of towels and stopped when she saw me. "Oh," she said smoothly, "I was going to go through that with you." "With me?" I asked. She set the basket down. "Bonnie, you brought so much from Florida, and some of it just doesn't really work in this house. I thought maybe we could simplify a little. You've said yourself you don't want to feel crowded." I lifted one of Daniel's books from the box. It was a hardback history of the Civil War, the spine worn and soft from years of handling. "This is not clutter," I said quietly. Jessica crossed her arms. "No one said clutter. But do you really need all of it? There are questions that are not questions. They are judgments in polite clothing. Do you really need all of it?" What she meant was, do you really need this much of yourself here? That night, I did not bring it up at dinner. I wanted to see whether Ryan noticed anything on his own. He did not. He talked about work. Jessica talked about a couple in the neighborhood who were redoing their kitchen in marble. I passed the bread, cleared the plates, and realized that silence can become a form of self-defense long before it becomes surrender. Then came the dining room. Daniel had loved a particular sideboard we bought on an anniversary trip to Savannah. It was not fancy, just solid and warm and beautifully made with deep drawers and a polished surface that glowed honey gold in the light. It had held holiday linens, silver candles, and every birthday cake I had ever set down in front of Ryan. One afternoon, it was gone. This time, Jessica did not even warn me first. In its place stood a pale, modern console table with skinny metal legs and no storage at all. A glass vase of eucalyptus branches sat on top along with 2 decorative bowls nobody in that house would ever use. I found Ryan in the kitchen and asked, "Where is the sideboard?" He glanced up from his phone. "Jess sold it." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. She sold it, yeah, he said, like we were discussing a lamp, to a woman from Facebook Marketplace. Apparently, she got a decent price. I stared at my son. That piece was mine. He sighed then, not with guilt but with impatience. Mom, you barely used it. That is not the point. Well, Jess said it was too heavy for the room. The room. I remember thinking then that objects had become safer to defend than people. Furniture could be called bulky. Photos could be called crowded. Books could be called too much. Memories could be called impractical. A mother could not be removed so easily, not yet, but everything around her could. You should have asked me, I said. Ryan finally put his phone down. Okay, maybe she should have. But do we have to make every little thing into an issue, every little thing? There it was again, that shrinking of my reality into something petty, manageable, almost embarrassing. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried harder than the disappearance of a piece of furniture should have made me cry. But it was never about the sideboard. It was about the steady stripping away of proof that I belonged anywhere at all. After that, I began paying closer attention. Jessica no longer bothered to hide her irritation when I entered a room she had mentally claimed. If I came into the kitchen while she was meal prepping, she would shift her body just enough to make me feel I was in the way. If I suggested a recipe Daniel used to love, she would smile and say, "That's a little heavy for how we eat now." If I mentioned inviting one of my old Florida friends to stay for a weekend visit, she said, "We'd probably need more notice for overnight guests." Overnight guests. In the home I had helped pay for. Ryan, meanwhile, became softer in tone and harder in substance. He never snapped at me outright. That would have required courage. Instead, he gave me gentle corrections, small reframings, little reminders that what I was experiencing was not what I thought it was. Jess is just under stress. You know she likes order. She's trying to make this place work for everybody. Everybody. Another dangerous word. One Friday afternoon, I was in the laundry room folding towels when I heard Jessica's voice drifting in from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking in the casual, confidential tone women use with friends they trust. I wasn't trying to listen. But then I heard my name. I stopped folding. Jessica laughed softly. "No, not yet, but we're getting there." A pause. Then she said, "Once her name is off a few more things, she won't have anywhere else to go." I froze. The towel slipped from my hands and landed at my feet. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The air in the laundry room felt suddenly thin, sharp, impossible. A few more things. What things? My name off, what? She continued talking, but her voice dropped lower and I could no longer make out the words. I stood there for several seconds, maybe longer, unable to move, unable even to breathe properly. It is a strange feeling hearing the truth before you fully understand it. It enters your body first, the mind catches up later. When I finally stepped into the kitchen a minute later, Jessica was leaning against the counter, with her phone still in hand, smiling down at something on the screen. She looked up and saw me, and not one flicker of guilt crossed her face. "Everything okay?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked at her. At the glossy hair, the calm mouth, the perfectly neutral expression. At the woman who had called me family while slowly dismantling every sign that I had a claim to that word. "Yes," I said. It was the first lie I told her on purpose. That evening, Ryan came home carrying takeout, cheerful and distracted. Jessica kissed his cheek. They laughed about something from the car ride. I set plates on the table with steady hands and listened to the normal sounds of a family dinner while a single, cold realization settled inside me. This was no longer about rudeness. It was no longer about decor control or a difficult adjustment. There was a plan here. Maybe not a fully formed one yet, maybe not one I could see in its entirety, but enough of one that Jessica believed my name needed to come off a few more things before I had nowhere else to go. And the most frightening part was not that she had said it. It was that she had said it so casually, as if my dependence were not just expected, as if it were the goal. That night, for the first time since moving to North Carolina, I locked my bedroom door before I went to sleep. And lying awake in the dark, I understood something I had been too lonely to see before. I had not been invited into a loving home. I had been maneuvered into position. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the kind of clarity that only comes after fear has burned away the last of your denial. For weeks, I had been trying to persuade myself that I was being oversensitive. That grief had made me fragile. That Jessica was controlling but not dangerous, and Ryan was passive but not disloyal. But once I heard her say once her name is off a few more things, she won't have anywhere else to go, I could no longer hide behind the comfort of confusion. Something was happening. Maybe it had been happening for a while, and if I wanted to protect myself, I needed facts, not feelings. I sat at the small table in my sitting area with a mug of tea and a yellow legal pad, staring out at the yard as the sky softened from black to blue-gray. Daniel used to say that panic makes a person sloppy, but information makes them dangerous. I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing behind me. Don't confront what you haven't documented, Bonnie. So I made a list. House paperwork, closing documents, bank transfers, title information, any account Ryan had helped me move, estate papers, insurance records, copies of anything with my signature. The list steadied me. It gave shape to the fear. After breakfast, I waited until Jessica left for a Pilates class and Ryan headed to work. Then I closed my bedroom door, took out the plastic storage file I had brought from Florida, and began going through every document I had kept. What I found first was not evidence of betrayal. It was evidence of my own exhaustion. There were folders labeled in my handwriting but sloppily. Dates I should have remembered blurred together. Some papers were clipped neatly. Others had been shoved into sleeves without order. I found Daniel's death certificate, our condo sale documents, statements from the investment account, and the moving company contract. I found sympathy cards I had not meant to keep mixed in with tax records. I found notes Ryan had written during phone calls about streamlining things and making transitions easier. I also found gaps, places where copies should have been but were not. Missing attachments, missing signature pages, missing explanatory notes. I sat back in the chair and pressed my fingers to my temple. That was the part nobody tells you about widowhood. It is not only sorrow, it is administration while heartbroken. It is legal language while numb. It is trusting the wrong hands because your own are shaking too hard to hold the pen steady. For several minutes, I simply looked at the papers spread across the bed and fought the urge to cry. Then I reached for my phone and called Harold Bennett. Harold had been Daniel's attorney for nearly 20 years. He handled our wills, reviewed a few investment-related matters, and once helped us untangle a mess when a contractor tried to take advantage of Daniel after storm damage. Harold was in his early 70s, now precise and dry-humored, with the kind of calm voice that made panic feel embarrassingly inefficient. When his receptionist put me through, I nearly lost my nerve. "Harold Bennett," he said. "Harold, it's Bonnie Peterson." There was a brief pause, then warmth entered his voice. "Bonnie, I was sorry to hear about Daniel. I meant every word in the note I sent." "Thank you," I said, and already my throat felt tight. "How can I help you?" I had planned to speak carefully, to sound composed, but something in the steadiness of his voice made honesty easier. "I think I need to review some paperwork," I said, related to the house I bought with Ryan and Jessica. He did not rush to fill the silence after that. "Good attorneys never do. What specifically concerns you?" he asked. I looked down at the stack of incomplete files on my bed. "I'm not entirely sure yet." "That's the problem." He was quiet for a moment. "All right. Start at the beginning." So I did. I told him about Daniel dying, about selling the condo in Florida, about Ryan urging me to move to North Carolina, about pooling resources for a larger home, about feeling overwhelmed during the closing. I did not mention Jessica's insult or the ugly details of daily life just yet. Instead, I focused on the sequence, the money, the signatures, the missing copies. When I finished, Harold asked, "Do you have any of the closing packet, some of it? Do you know how title was taken?" I hesitated. "Not off the top of my head. Do you recall whether there was any separate agreement regarding your contribution to the down payment?" I closed my eyes. "There may have been." Ryan said something about protecting everyone and making it clean, but I was dealing with so much at the time. "Was your contribution documented as a gift?" That question made my stomach tighten. "I don't remember." "Bonnie," he said gently, "I need you not to guess. Only tell me what you know." That more than anything brought me back to myself. What I knew was smaller than what I feared. "I know I provided a substantial portion of the money," I said. "I know Ryan coordinated most of the practical steps because I trusted him. I know I signed papers I should have reviewed more carefully, and I know I don't have complete copies of everything." "All right," he said. "That's enough to begin." He told me to gather every record I had, paper copies, emails, bank statements, text messages related to the purchase, anything referencing the sale of my Florida condo and the transfer of funds. He said not to discuss any of this with Ryan or Jessica yet. He also asked a question that sat in my chest long after the call ended. Has anyone in that house given you reason to believe they are trying to diminish your control over your own affairs? I thought of Jessica's voice. Once her name is off a few more things, I thought of my missing papers, Daniel's chair in the garage, my sideboard sold, my photographs in a cabinet. Yes, I said quietly. I think so. Harold did not sound surprised. Then discretion matters, he said. Send me what you have. I'll review it. And Bonnie, yes, do not let embarrassment keep you from protecting yourself. Grief makes trusting people easier. That is not a moral failure. After I hung up, I sat very still. I had not realized how much shame I had been carrying. Shame at not knowing exactly what I had signed. Shame at being nearly 70 and still vulnerable to being manipulated by the two people who should have protected me. Shame at needing help to untangle something I had entered willingly. Harold's words loosened something in me. Not enough to make me feel safe, but enough to make me feel less foolish. That afternoon, I began a quieter kind of work. I searched my email for every message related to the move, the house, the closing, and financial transfers. I printed threads between Ryan and me, especially the ones where he used phrases like, "I'll handle it," and "this is the easiest way." I found confirmation notices from the wire transfer tied to my condo proceeds. I found a scanned page attached to an email from the lender's office with language I did not fully understand but recognized from closing week. More importantly, I found evidence of how thoroughly I had leaned on Ryan. He had scheduled calls, forwarded instructions, summarized terms, told me which pages weren't anything to worry about. At the time, that had felt like love. Now it looked dangerously close to control. Twice that day, I heard cars in the driveway and scrambled to stack papers back into neat piles before anyone could walk in. When Jessica came to my door around 4 and asked whether I wanted salmon or chicken for dinner, I turned from the bed so she would not see the folders spread around me. "Chicken is fine," I said. She smiled. "You've been in here all day. Everything okay?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "I'm just organizing things," I said. "Well," she replied lightly, "that's always a good idea." Then she left. I waited until I heard her footsteps fade before exhaling. That night at dinner, Ryan mentioned rising property values in the neighborhood. Jessica said something about how smart it had been to get in when we did. I kept my face neutral and took small bites of chicken while every word at that table sounded newly dangerous. We, our house, long-term plans. By then, those words no longer sounded domestic to me. They sounded strategic. The next morning, I drove to a shipping store 10 minutes away and paid to scan a full batch of documents so I could send clean copies to Harold. I remember standing at the counter with my purse tucked under my arm and a stack of papers in a manila folder, feeling like an undercover version of myself. The girl at the register, no older than 22, smiled and said, "Big project." I almost laughed. You could say that. By late afternoon, I had emailed Harold everything I could gather. He replied just before 6. "Received. I've only skimmed the first set, but there are already a few things I want to examine closely. Do not raise alarms at home. We'll speak tomorrow." I read that message 3 times. A few things I want to examine closely. That was all. No conclusions, no promises, no dramatic revelation, but it was enough. Enough to tell me I was not imagining the problem. Enough to confirm that the discomfort I had spent weeks swallowing had a structure underneath it. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the dark with the glow from my phone in my lap and understood something for the first time with painful clarity. I had trusted my son at the exact moment in my life when I was least equipped to protect myself. And whatever came next, I could no longer afford to be the grieving mother who assumed love would make people honorable. I was going to have to become someone else now. Someone quieter, someone sharper, someone who did not need to be believed right away because she was finally going to have proof. Once you begin seeing people clearly, they often stop pretending as hard. I do not know whether Jessica sensed something had changed in me after I spoke with Harold or whether she had simply grown tired of performing kindness. Maybe both. But in the days that followed, whatever softness had once coated her, behavior began peeling away so fast, I sometimes wondered how I had missed the truth for as long as I had. She did not become openly monstrous overnight. Women like Jessica rarely do. She was too polished for that, too strategic. Instead, she became carelessly sharp, blunt in the ways people are when they believe they already have the upper hand. It showed first in her tone. "Bonnie, can you not leave your shoes there? It makes the entryway feel cluttered. Bonnie, if you're going to use the good skillet, please wash it right away. I need things where I expect them. Bonnie, you really should write things down more. I've noticed you asking the same question twice sometimes. That last one came with a little laugh as if we were sharing some harmless truth about aging. I looked up from my tea. I asked because you changed the appointment time after telling me something different yesterday." Jessica blinked once, then smiled. "Did I? Maybe. Maybe. That was the new rhythm too. Corrections disguised as concern, dismissals wrapped in civility. Tiny suggestions that my memory, my pace, my habits, even my presence were all becoming a problem. Someone younger and more efficient would eventually have to manage. Ryan was changing with her. At first I told myself he was only exhausted. He had been working longer hours and stress showed in the set of his jaw and the way he loosened his tie the moment he stepped through the front door. But stress does not invent words. It only reveals which ones a person is willing to borrow. One evening, I was in the kitchen around 6 chopping celery for chicken salad when Ryan came in, opened the refrigerator, and frowned. "Mom, Jess was looking for those prepped vegetables. I'm using some for dinner," I said. He sighed. "Can you just check with her first? She has a system." "A system?" "In the kitchen," I asked. He rubbed his forehead. "Why does everything have to turn into a thing?" I set the knife down carefully. "Ryan, I cooked in kitchens before your wife was born." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "No one's saying you didn't." But his tone said exactly that. The exchange was small, almost absurd in its banality. Still, I stood there after he walked out, staring at the cutting board, and felt the humiliation settle over me like dust. Not because of the vegetables. Never because of the vegetables. Because my son had spoken to me like I was a disruptive guest who had mishandled the rules of someone else's household. That weekend, I found the first brochure. It was tucked in the junk drawer beside rubber bands, batteries, and takeout menus. If I had not been looking for a roll of tape, I might never have seen it. The cover showed a silver-haired couple walking hand in hand through a landscaped courtyard, both of them smiling as if old age were just a sponsored stroll through managed flower beds. Maple Grove Senior Living Independent. Assisted. Memory support. I stared at it for several seconds before pulling out 2 more beneath it. One was for a retirement village outside Hendersonville. Another advertised continuum of care in a gated campus with dining packages and medication oversight. Medication oversight. I do not remember breathing for a moment. I gathered the brochures in my hands and looked toward the hallway, half expecting Jessica to appear and explain them away. She did not. Instead, I slipped them back into the drawer exactly as I had found them and closed it with slow, careful fingers. That afternoon, I sat in my room pretending to read while my mind ran in tight circles. Maybe they were for someone else. Maybe Jessica had picked them up for a church friend. Maybe. But no explanation could soften the truth of what those brochures meant inside that house. Somebody had brought them home. Somebody had placed them where they could be referenced again. Somebody had considered options for what to do with me. With me. I thought of Harold's question. Has anyone in that house given you reason to believe they are trying to diminish your control over your own affairs? Yes, I thought now. More reason every day. The next clear sign came 3 nights later. Jessica and Ryan thought I had gone to bed. I had changed into my nightgown and turned out the lamp, but I was still awake when I realized I had left my phone charging in the kitchen. I opened my bedroom door quietly and stepped into the dim hallway just as their voices drifted in from the breakfast nook. I stopped when I heard Jessica say my name. "She can't stay in limbo forever, Ryan." His answer came lower, tired. "I know." "No, you don't know," Jessica snapped, her voice hushed but edged. "You avoid. That's what you do." There was a pause. I moved 1 step closer, staying in the shadow near the laundry room. Then Jessica said the sentence that finally stripped all illusion away. "The sooner we get her out, the sooner we can refinance and breathe." I gripped the wall. Ryan exhaled hard. Lower your voice. I am lowering it, she hissed. I'm also telling the truth. We are drowning, and that house is the only real asset we have. The only real asset we have, not the only asset they had. The house I had helped buy, the house they had slowly been reclassifying in language and behavior until I felt like the extra body in a space they meant to leverage. Ryan spoke again, quieter now. I said, I'm working on it. Working on it. Jessica laughed, once low and bitter. By doing what, waiting for her to volunteer herself into assisted living, you said she trusts you. Use that. There are moments when betrayal is so plain it almost becomes surreal. You wait for a softer interpretation to arrive and rescue you. None comes. I stood frozen in the dark, my heart hitting so hard against my ribs it seemed impossible they could not hear it. Then Ryan said something that hurt me more than anything Jessica had spoken. She's fragile right now, he muttered. If I push too hard, she'll get suspicious. Fragile, not grieving, not vulnerable, not my mother. Fragile as if I were a condition to be managed, a structure likely to crack if mishandled. Jessica answered with a cold impatience I would hear in my sleep for weeks afterward. Ryan, I'm done organizing our whole life around your mother's emotions. Our life, your mother's emotions. I backed away before they could say more. I moved so slowly I could feel each board beneath my feet. By the time I reached my room, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on the edge of the bed to steady them. I did not cry immediately. That is what surprised me. The old version of me, the Bonnie who still believed pain should be absorbed quietly for the sake of family peace, would have dissolved right then. But something in me had been shifting since Harold's first phone call, and that night the shift became undeniable. The grief was still there, yes. The heartbreak too. But beneath both of them something colder had taken shape, clarity. The next morning I watched them over breakfast with a stillness that felt almost outside myself. Jessica, in a cream sweater set, scrolled through her phone and mentioned a lunch meeting about brand strategy for the boutique. She had expanded too fast and I was beginning to suspect run badly. Ryan barely touched his toast. There were shadows under his eyes. I would later learn those shadows had names, credit card debt, overdue balances, vendor pressure, and a car payment that had no business attached to their income. At the time, all I knew was that money had curled itself around the house like a vine, and they saw me as the obstacle between them and relief. Jessica looked up from her phone. Bonnie, did you ever decide whether you want me to schedule that neurologist your church friend mentioned? I blinked. Why would I need a neurologist? She gave a small shrug. Well, with the memory slips, it's probably nothing. But better to be proactive. Ryan did not look at me. I set down my coffee cup. I do not have memory slips. Jessica smiled sympathetically, which was somehow worse than open contempt. Of course. Of course. In that moment, I saw the next stage of the plan as clearly as if it had been typed out and slid across the table. First inconvenience, then concern, then documentation. Then a story in which I was aging poorly, forgetting things needing oversight, a story they could tell other people before I even understood I had become its subject. That afternoon, I began paying attention not only to what they said, but to what the house itself revealed. Past due notices hidden beneath a stack of magazines in the study. A credit card voicemail Jessica deleted too quickly when it played on speaker while her hands were wet. Ryan swearing under his breath at a banking app on his phone. An argument cut short when I entered the garage and heard only the tail end Jessica saying, I'm not selling the SUV because your mother refuses to move. That night after they went upstairs, I sat at my little desk and wrote down every line I could remember. The sooner we get her out, the sooner we can refinance and breathe. You said she trusts you. Use that. She's fragile right now. I'm done organizing our whole life around your mother's emotions. Neurologist. Memory slips. I wrote until my hand cramped. Then I took out the brochures from the kitchen drawer, photographed each one, and slid them into a folder in my dresser beneath Daniel's watch box. By the time I turned off the lamp, one fact had rooted itself so firmly in me that I knew I would never uproot it again. This was not just about disrespect. It was not even just about greed. Ryan and Jessica were building a case socially, emotionally, and perhaps eventually legally that I was declining, difficult, and better off somewhere else. And all the while, the real issue was not my age. It was their debt, their panic. Their belief that my trust could still be used as a bridge to whatever piece of my life they had not yet taken control of. Lying awake in the dark, I pressed my palm flat against the blanket and thought of Daniel. He had always said money does not create character, it exposes it. In that house, under that roof, mine was beginning to harden. Theirs was beginning to rot in plain sight. After that night in the hallway, I stopped listening to Ryan and Jessica as family. I started listening to them as evidence. That sounds colder than I mean it to, but perhaps coldness was exactly what I needed by then. Warmth had made me vulnerable. Warmth had made me excuse things I should have questioned. Warmth had dressed manipulation up as concern and let it sit at my table. So I began paying attention the way Daniel used to, when something in the numbers at work did not add up, not emotionally but systematically. And once I did, their life began unraveling in front of me faster than I would have believed. The first clear sign was the mail. Jessica liked to have to bring it in quickly, usually before I could reach the front table where she sorted it. At first I thought that was simple habit. Then I noticed the speed of it, the way she flipped envelopes over before opening them, the way she sometimes slid one or two pieces straight into her tote bag instead of leaving them with the others. One Tuesday morning, however, she was out early for a hair appointment and Ryan had already left for work. I heard the mailbox lid clink and stepped outside before the delivery truck had even turned the corner. There were grocery coupons, a water bill, a catalog, and 3 envelopes with red print on the corners. I took them inside and stood at the counter, staring at those red-letter notices, my heart beating too fast for something as ordinary as paper. I should have left them unopened. I knew that. But I also knew no one in that house had shown the same respect for my boundaries they demanded for theirs. One envelope was from a credit card company and addressed to Jessica. Payment reminder. Immediate attention requested. Another was a notice from a business supplier I vaguely recognized from her boutique. The third was for Ryan, an auto finance statement with a late fee added. I did not open them further. I did not need to. I laid them exactly where Jessica usually sorted the mail and went back to my room, but my mind did not go with me. It stayed in the kitchen under those red warnings, adding up things I had not wanted to count before. The boutique. The white SUV Jessica had insisted was a business necessity for branding. The weekend trips to Charleston and Nashville that somehow still happened even after she had begun complaining about cash flow. The new sectional sofa upstairs. The half-joking conversations about leveraging assets. That afternoon when Jessica came in carrying 2 shopping bags from the salon district, I heard the rustle of mail stop her in the kitchen. Silence. Then a cabinet door closing too hard. At dinner, she was brittle and overbright. Ryan was quieter than usual. Neither looked directly at me. That more than anything confirmed what I had already begun to suspect: their finances were not merely strained. They were buckling. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched for patterns. Once, while passing the den, I heard Ryan on a call saying, "No, I understand the balance is past due, but we're waiting on funds to clear." Another afternoon, Jessica was on speakerphone with someone from her boutique inventory account and snapped, "I said I would handle it by Friday." When she noticed me in the doorway holding a basket of clean towels, she ended the call so abruptly, the silence that followed seemed to slap the room. I started noticing arguments too, not the kind with raised voices and slammed doors, but the jagged, low-toned marital warfare of 2 people trying not to let a witness hear the whole of it. "You said spring sales would cover it. They would have if you hadn't pushed the expansion. I pushed it because you kept saying we needed to grow. We need liquidity, Jess, not another photo shoot." Liquidity. There is something sobering about hearing your son use the vocabulary of quiet desperation. One Friday evening, I was carrying a glass of water down the hallway when I heard them in the pantry just off the kitchen. The door was cracked. I might have kept walking if Jessica had not spoken my name. "She is sitting on money, Ryan." I stopped. His response came quickly. "Not like you think. She sold a Florida condo and had Dad's investment accounts," Jessica shot back. "Don't tell me she doesn't have reserves." I stood frozen by the hall table, the condensation from the glass dampening my fingers. Ryan lowered his voice. "Most of that went into the house." Jessica gave a short, frustrated laugh. "Exactly. Which is why this is insane. We're all standing inside the answer and acting like it's untouchable. The answer. The house." I could picture her perfectly without even seeing her face. One hand on her hip, chin tilted, eyes hard, with the fury of a person who believes she is being denied something she has already mentally spent. Ryan said. I'm trying to figure out the cleanest way. Cleanest for who, Jessica asked. Because from where I'm standing, we keep making our whole life smaller to accommodate your mother's grief while bills pile up. I moved away before they could say more. This time I did cry, but only for a minute, and not in the way I used to, not helplessly, not like someone collapsing under pain. It was the cry of a person watching the final mask fall off a familiar face. They were not simply frustrated with living together. They were not merely selfish. They were counting on the house, counting on it as leverage, as collateral, as escape, as rescue. And they had folded me into that equation not as family, but as the last obstacle between themselves and whatever financial relief they imagined the property could provide. Later that night, I sat with a notebook and began listing every visible sign of trouble. Late notices in the mail, supplier pressure tied to Jessica's boutique, Ryan's car payment behind frequent private arguments about refinancing, mentions of liquidity and needing funds, pressure to move me out framed as concern, assisted living brochures, suggestion of cognitive decline, discussion of cognitive decline. Using my trust, the list ran across 2 pages. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time, I let myself say the whole truth plainly in my own mind. They need the value in this house more than they need me. That realization should have devastated me. Instead, strangely, it steadied me. Because clarity, even cruel clarity, is easier to work with than hope that keeps changing shape. A few days later, the final piece clicked into place. Ryan had gone upstairs to shower after work, and Jessica was in the backyard on the phone, pacing near the fence with her Bluetooth earpiece in. I was in my sitting area by the window with a book open in my lap, though I had not read the same paragraph in 10 minutes. Her voice carried just enough through the cracked patio door for fragments to float in. "No, the boutique's not dead," she said sharply. "It's just tied up." A pause. "Then yes, I know what I owe." Another pause. "I'm telling you, once the property situation is resolved, we can reset everything." I did not move. Property situation. Not house. Not family arrangement. Not household issue. Property situation. That was how she thought of it now. That was how she described the place where I slept, where Daniel's photograph sat on my dresser, where I drank my tea each morning and said my prayers at night. A property situation. I knew then that whatever affection she had shown me in the beginning had never been rooted in love or even respect. It had been rooted in access, in proximity, in making me comfortable enough to step into an arrangement that would later trap me. When Ryan came downstairs, I watched him differently too. He looked tired, older somehow. There were fine lines starting near his eyes that I did not remember from 2 years before. He stood at the refrigerator for a long time, staring into it as if decisions might be hidden behind the milk. For a moment, a brief, dangerous moment, I saw the little boy who used to come into my bedroom after nightmares and curl beside me until morning. Then he shut the refrigerator, saw me watching, and looked away. That was the moment I understood something I had resisted admitting. Ryan was not merely being led by Jessica. That would have been easier for me, wouldn't it, to believe my son had simply married a manipulative woman and gotten swept along by her ambition. But the truth was harder and more honest than that. He was participating, perhaps less elegantly than she was, perhaps with more guilt, but still participating. He knew about the debt. He knew about the plan to move me out. He knew they were building a case that I was fragile, forgetful, and better off elsewhere. And he was doing what weak men often do when cowardice feels more survivable than conscience, letting someone bolder say the ugliest parts out loud while he prepared to benefit from them. That night at dinner, Jessica mentioned a kitchen renovation idea she had seen online: white oak cabinets, brass fixtures, and expanded island. Ryan nodded absently and said, "Maybe later once things are settled." I almost laughed. Settled. It was such a harmless word for what they meant. After the dishes were done, I carried my tea back to my room and sat by the window as darkness settled over the yard. The neighborhood looked peaceful from there. Porch lights, crickets, a neighbor walking a golden retriever past the mailbox. The kind of evening that suggests life is orderly and decent. Inside the house, however, every illusion had finally burned away. I was not being misunderstood. I was being managed. I was not in the way by accident. I was in the way of their financial plan. And if I did nothing, they would keep tightening the story around me until even my objections could be dismissed as confusion, grief, or age. I set my teacup down and folded my hands in my lap. No more. No more waiting for Ryan to remember who he was. No more hoping Jessica would grow a conscience. No more shrinking myself inside a house built partly from my money and wholly from my trust. By then, I did not yet know exactly what Harold was going to uncover in the paperwork. I did not yet know how much power I still had. But I knew one thing with complete certainty: I was done letting them define the situation before I had even named it for myself. And whatever came next, it would not begin with pleading. It would begin with proof. The day Jessica told me to pack my bags began like any other, quietly, almost politely, which in hindsight feels like its own kind of cruelty. It was a Thursday in late September. The air outside had that first sharp edge of fall, and the maple tree in the front yard had just started turning at the tips. I remember because I stood at my bedroom window that morning looking out at those leaves and thinking how strange it was that the world could still move gently while something so ugly was taking shape inside my own life. Ryan had left early for work after a rushed breakfast and a muttered apology about a conference call. Jessica came downstairs around 9, wearing cream-colored leggings and a fitted black sweater, looking polished in the effortless way women like her always seem to manage. She poured herself coffee, scrolled through her phone, and barely acknowledged me beyond a distracted morning. By then, I had learned to read atmosphere the way sailors read wind. Something was off. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a brittle little tension in the way she set down her mug too hard and sighed at things that did not require sighing. She spent most of the morning opening cabinets, shutting them again, making lists on her phone, and muttering about costs. Around 11, she took a call in the den and came out with her mouth set in a thin line. I was at the kitchen table, sorting coupons and clipping an article from the local paper about a church clothing drive, when she stopped near the island and said without looking at me, "Did you move the grocery envelope?" I glanced up. The what? The cash envelope from the drawer. The one for groceries. No. She turned then, and the expression on her face was not anger exactly. It was annoyance, sharpened by the need for a target. "Well, it's not where I left it. I haven't touched your envelopes, Jessica." She gave a tight little laugh. Okay, that one word had become a weapon in her hands. Okay never meant acceptance. It meant accusation postponed. I returned to clipping the article, but the room no longer felt ordinary. I could sense her moving behind me, opening drawers harder than necessary, shifting items around, making a show of searching. 10 minutes later, she said, "You know, this is exactly why systems matter." I laid the scissors down. "Are you suggesting I took your money?" She crossed her arms and leaned back against the counter. "I'm saying that when too many people are in one house and no one respects how things are organized, things go missing. Too many people. There it was plain as day. I felt heat rise in my chest. I have respected plenty in this house." She smiled then, but it was the coldest expression I had ever seen on her face. I should have walked away. That is the truth I can admit now. I should have stood up, taken my paper clippings, and gone back to my room. But there comes a point in prolonged disrespect when leaving the room feels too much like agreeing with the version of events being built around you. And I was so tired of swallowing insult after insult that my body stayed planted even while some wiser part of me whispered, "Don't give her the scene she wants." "I don't know what game you're playing," I said, keeping my voice low, "but I'm not going to be talked to like a thief." Jessica pushed off the counter and walked toward the table. "Everything becomes so dramatic with you, Bonnie. With me, yes, with you. Every boundary is a personal attack. Every decision is an insult. Every practical conversation turns into this wounded little performance." I stared at her. A wounded little performance. The phrase hit me with such force that for a second I could not speak. It was not only cruel, it was revealing. It told me exactly how she had been translating my pain all along, not as pain, but as inconvenience. "I buried my husband 2 years ago," I said. "I sold my home. I put my money into this house because Ryan asked me to trust both of you. If you think my presence here is a performance, then you don't know the first thing about sacrifice." Jessica laughed. Actually laughed. Not loudly. Not wildly. Just one sharp, disbelieving burst, like I had said something quaint and embarrassing. "Sacrifice," she said. "Bonnie, do you hear yourself?" I pushed my chair back and stood. "Yes," I said. "Do you?" At that exact moment, Ryan walked in through the garage door. He must have forgotten something for work because he still had his laptop bag over one shoulder and his keys in his hand. He paused the instant he felt the tension in the room. "What's going on?" he asked. I turned to him, And for one foolish second I thought, good, he's here. He'll hear this. He'll stop it. Jessica answered before I could. Your mother is accusing me of treating her like a criminal because I asked about grocery money. That is not what happened, I said. Ryan exhaled sharply, already tired of a conflict he had not even bothered to understand. Can we not do this right now? Do this, as if disrespect simply existed on its own with no cause and no perpetrator. I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had once sat beside through fevers and broken hearts and the ache of growing up, and I saw in his face the same thing I had been seeing for months, not confusion, avoidance. I'm not the one doing this, I said. Jessica turned toward him with both palms lifted, the picture of exhausted innocence. Ryan, I can't keep living like this. I really can't. Living like this. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us. Ryan dropped his keys onto the island. Mom, maybe everyone just needs some space. There are sentences that split a life in two. That was one of them. Not Jessica apologize. Not Mom, what happened. Not nobody is going anywhere. Just maybe. Everyone just needs some space. I looked at him and felt something inside me begin to tear. Space, I repeated. Jessica gave a humorless little smile and shook her head as if even this conversation were beneath her patience. Then she said the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. Honestly, she said, pack your bags, old lady. Silence fell so hard it felt physical. Even now I can still see every detail from that moment with terrible clarity. The bowl of apples on the island. The weak afternoon light on the floorboards, Ryan's face going still, Jessica's chin slightly lifted as if she had finally said out loud what she had been building toward all along. I think some part of me expected Ryan to react then, to recoil, to say her name in warning, to tell her she had gone too far. He did none of it. He looked at me. Then he looked away. That hurt more than her words. Cruelty from a cruel person wounds you in one way. Silence from your own child wounds you in another, deeper place entirely. Jessica had insulted me, yes, but Ryan had confirmed I was unprotected. I do not remember what expression I had on my face. I only remember my body suddenly feeling both heavy and hollow. Jessica folded her arms. This isn't working anymore. Ryan spoke at last, but his voice was low and infuriatingly soft, as though gentleness could somehow make betrayal less ugly. Mom, maybe this situation has run its course. I looked at him. Are you asking me to leave? He did not answer directly. Cowardice almost never does. I'm saying, he replied, that maybe some distance would be good for everyone. That was the moment something in me broke clean through. Not loudly, not dramatically. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I did not hurl back all the truths I had gathered and all the suspicions I had tucked away like evidence in the dark. I simply nodded once. Then I picked up the newspaper clipping from the table, folded it carefully, and walked out of the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Jessica let out a breath, almost relief, almost triumph. Ryan said my name once weakly, but he did not follow me. I went to my room, closed the door, and locked it. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself fall apart. I cried harder than I had cried the day Daniel's suit was brought home from the funeral home in plastic. Harder than I had cried the first night in the Sarasota condo after the casseroles stopped coming and the silence turned permanent. This grief was different. Widowhood had been cruel, but it had not humiliated me. It had not looked me in the face and told me I was disposable. I pressed my fist to my mouth to keep from making noise. In the middle of those tears, memories came in jagged flashes. Ryan at 5 asleep with one sticky hand wrapped around my finger after a county fair. Ryan at 13 sobbing in the car after his first heartbreak, while I told him no pain lasted forever, even when it felt like it might. Ryan at 17 standing in a borrowed cap and gown while Daniel and I cheered so loudly people turned to stare. I had built so much of my life around loving that boy, and somehow I had ended up in a locked bedroom in a house my money helped buy, being told by his wife to pack my bags. At some point, the crying stopped, not because I felt better, but because something else arrived. Stillness. I lifted my head and looked around the room. Daniel's photograph on the dresser, my blue quilt, the leather watch box in the drawer, the folder of brochures I had hidden, the notes I had written, the copies I had sent Harold, and beneath the rawness, beneath the humiliation, beneath the terrible knowledge of my son's silence, one thought rose with a calm so sharp it almost startled me. I am not leaving like this, not begging, not apologizing. not carrying my suitcase out the front door while Jessica stood there satisfied and Ryan hid behind soft words. If I left this house, it would not be because they had reduced me to something removable. It would be because I chose the terms. I stood up slowly and went to the mirror above the dresser. My face was blotched red. My eyes looked older than I remembered. But there was something else there too, something I had not seen in months. Not hope, not softness. Resolve. Jessica thought she had won because she had finally said the ugliest thing aloud. Ryan thought silence would spare him from the consequences of choosing sides. Neither of them understood yet that humiliation can do something grief alone cannot. It can burn away the last of a woman's hesitation. By the time I unlocked my bedroom door that evening, I was still heartbroken. But I was no longer undecided. The morning after Jessica told me to pack my bags, I woke with a swollen face, a pounding head, and a kind of calm that felt almost unnatural. Not peace. Peace is soft. This was not soft. This was the stillness that comes after something inside you has finished breaking and started hardening in its place. I moved through my routine carefully, washed my face, put on a navy sweater, and pressed slacks, made the bed, smoothed the quilt, opened the drawer where I had hidden the folder with the senior living brochures and my handwritten notes. Then I added one more page to the stack. September 28, Jessica, pack your bags, old lady. Ryan present. Did not defend me. Said maybe distance would be good for everyone. I underlined the date twice. Downstairs, the house was unusually quiet. Ryan had already left for work. Jessica was in the den on a call, her voice sweet and professional, in a way that would have been almost impressive if I had not already seen what sat beneath it. I did not speak to her. I poured myself coffee, took one piece of toast, and returned to my room with the tray. At 10:30, I drove to Harold Bennett's office. He still practiced out of the same red brick building downtown that Daniel and I had visited for years, just off a tree-lined street with angled parking and old iron benches. Walking into that office, without Daniel beside me, felt strange in a way I had not expected. His absence met me there before Harold did. In the waiting room, in the polished wood trim, in the faint smell of paper and coffee, in the memory of Daniel leaning back in one of those chairs years earlier joking that attorneys charged by the minute because they had learned silence was profitable. When Harold came out to greet me, his face softened. Bonnie. I stood and let him take both my hands briefly in his. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, thinner through the shoulders, whiter around the temples, but his eyes were as alert as ever. Come in, he said. His office was lined with framed degrees, dark bookcases, and rows of organized files that made me feel instantly less foolish for coming. There are rooms where panic expands and rooms where it shrinks. Harold's office had always been the second kind. Once I sat down, he did not waste time. I reviewed everything you sent, he said, folding his hands on the desk, and I'm very glad you called before confronting anyone. My stomach tightened. That doesn't sound good. It sounds complicated, he corrected, but not bad for you. For a moment, I only stared at him. He slid a folder toward himself and opened it. Inside were copies of the closing documents, my bank transfer records, and several pages marked with colored tabs. Let's walk through this carefully, he said. When the property was purchased, your funds made up the majority of the down payment. That part is clear. The title, however, was structured in a way that Ryan and Jessica likely do not fully understand or chose not to understand. I leaned forward. What does that mean? It means, he said, tapping one page, that while Ryan and Jessica are on the deed, your financial contribution was not treated as a simple gift. There is a separate agreement attached to the purchase documentation drafted at closing that preserves your beneficial interest in the property and places significant restrictions on any sale, refinance, or transfer without your participation. I blinked. Beneficial interest. In plain English, Harold said, your money did not disappear into their equity. You retained an enforceable legal stake. I felt the air change in the room, not because I fully understood every term. I did not. But because I understood enough. They can't just push me out and refinance, I asked. No. The word landed with a force almost physical. Harold continued. More than that, under the terms of this agreement, if the co-living arrangement materially breaks down, especially if there's evidence of bad faith, you have remedies available. I gripped the armrest of the chair. What kind of remedies? He looked directly at me. You can force a sale. For several seconds I did not speak. I heard the words. I even understood them. But my body lagged behind as if it had grown too used to fear and needed time to believe in the possibility of power. "Force a sale," I repeated quietly. Harold nodded once. "Yes." My eyes went to the papers in front of him, then to the window, then back again. "This house," I said, slowly, "the house they think they're going to use to get rid of me, cannot be treated as theirs alone," Harold finished. A strange sound escaped me, then not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, something between disbelief and relief. Harold let the silence sit for a moment before going on. "Bonnie, I need you to understand something clearly. The structure here is unusual, but it is valid. Whoever handled this closing likely presented it to you as protection for everyone involved. In practice, what it did was preserve your leverage." I frowned. Ryan handled most of it. Harold's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Then either he did not read carefully or he assumed you never would. That hurt more than I wanted it to. Not because it was surprising by then, because it made sense. Ryan had always skimmed, always trusted summaries over details. Daniel used to say our son had a dangerous habit of being confident in rooms he had not fully listened to. Perhaps Ryan had assumed anything signed in the haze of my widowhood would stay buried there. Perhaps he had heard enough at closing to think he and Jessica were secure, then let arrogance do the rest. Or perhaps the crueler possibility he had known just enough to think he could maneuver around me later. I looked up. "Can they challenge it? Anyone can try," Harold said. "But based on what I've seen, they would not have a strong case unless there's something major we have not uncovered. Your contribution is documented. The agreement is signed. The restrictions are clear." I let out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding. For months, really for years, if I was honest, I had been moving through life as if safety were something that had already been taken from me. First by death, then by loneliness, then by dependence. Sitting in Harold's office, listening to him explain the legal truth, I felt something returning that I had not even known I was missing. Ground. Not comfort. Not innocence. But ground. Harold leaned back slightly. "Now, before we discuss next steps, I need to ask directly, has the breakdown in the household become explicit?" I met his gaze. "Yesterday, Jessica told me to pack my bags." His jaw tightened. "In front of Ryan, yes." And his response, I swallowed. He said maybe distance would be good for everyone. Harold was quiet for a beat, then nodded once as if checking a box in his own mind. "That matters," he said. I almost smiled bitterly. I had a feeling it might. "It matters because if they are taking the position that the arrangement is no longer workable, they do not get to make that argument only when it benefits them. The agreement cuts both ways." I sat back in the chair, my pulse beginning to steady into something deliberate. "What do I do now?" Harold closed the folder gently. "That depends on what outcome you want." The question should have been simple. It was not. What did I want? An apology. Too small. To stay impossible. For Ryan to wake up and become the son I remembered. Too late for that. I looked down at my hands. "I want to protect myself." "Good," Harold said. "That's the right starting point." He laid out the options with the same calm precision he had always used. We could send a formal notice asserting my rights and demanding cooperation regarding the property. We could begin preparing for partition and sale. We could also move quietly at first, gather more documentation, secure my finances, make arrangements for alternative housing, and choose the moment of disclosure carefully. The advantage, he said, is that they likely believe time is on their side. It is not. That sentence did something to me. For weeks, I had lived under the pressure of their timetable, their whispers, their brochures, their urgency. Their financial panic had filled the house like weather, and without realizing it, I had begun moving to the rhythm of it, fearing what they might do next, how soon they might act, whether I could hold my footing long enough to resist. But time was not on their side. It was on mine. I asked Harold if there was any scenario in which leaving quietly would protect me better than asserting myself. "Only if you wanted peace at the cost of equity," he said. "And from what you've described, I don't believe peace was ever truly being offered." "No," I thought. "Only surrender." He gave me the name of a discreet real estate agent, Megan Cole, whom he trusted if the time came to list the property quickly. He also told me to stop discussing anything financial in the house, stop signing anything at all without sending it to him first, and move any irreplaceable documents or heirlooms somewhere secure. When I rose to leave, I felt different than when I had arrived. Still wounded, still humiliated, still grieving the son I thought I had, but no longer cornered. At the door, Harold said, "Bonnie." I turned. "Whatever they have made you feel in that house, don't mistake emotional cruelty for legal strength. Those are not the same thing." I nodded because I suddenly understood that distinction with startling clarity. Jessica had power over atmosphere. Ryan had power over my heart. But neither of them not really had the final power they believed they did over that house. When I stepped back out into the afternoon sun, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I stood beside my car for a moment, one hand on the roof, and let the reality settle fully into my bones. The house they planned to use as my cage was still in the ways that mattered tied to me. The roof over their heads, the walls they had claimed, the kitchen where Jessica laughed, the hallway where Ryan learned to look away. I could sell it. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally. I could make them leave the very place they thought gave them the right to push me out. And for the first time since Daniel died, I felt something fiercer than grief rise inside me. Not vengeance, something steadier, authority. By the time I drove home, I had not yet decided exactly how I would use it. But I knew this much with absolute certainty: I was not the helpless old woman Jessica thought she had cornered. I was the one person in that house who still held the deed to its ending. Once Harold told me I could force the sale, the house changed again. It looked the same, of course. Same gray siding, same polished kitchen island, same staircase Jessica came down every morning like she was descending into a life she had earned. But for me, the illusion had finally reversed. I was no longer moving through those rooms like a woman waiting to be displaced. I was moving through them like a witness gathering the last pieces of a case. And if I am honest, that shift frightened me a little. Not because I doubted Harold, because power once returned to a person who has been humiliated can become a dangerous thing if it is driven only by pain. I knew I did not want revenge for revenge's sake. I did not want to become cruel simply because cruelty had been done to me. But I also knew something else with equal clarity. If I hesitated too long out of a desire to remain the good one, Ryan and Jessica would keep building their story around me until my kindness became the rope they used to finish tying me down. So I made a decision. I would move carefully, quietly, legally, completely. The first step was money. The following Monday, I drove to a bank branch 20 minutes away instead of the one closest to the house. I wore a tan coat and a scarf Daniel had bought me years ago, and I carried a folder so slim no one glancing at it would have thought anything important was inside. But my hand still shook when I sat across from a young banker named Elise and asked to open a new checking account in my name only. "Any particular reason you're opening a separate account today?" she asked politely, clicking through forms on her computer. I smiled in the careful way women smile when they do not want to tell the whole truth. "Just organizing some personal matters." She nodded, not pressing. I deposited only a modest amount to start, enough not to draw attention if anyone later saw the transfer, but enough to give myself immediate independence if things turned quickly. Then I requested fresh checks sent to a P.O. box Harold's office had helped me arrange that morning. It felt dramatic, almost silly, to take precautions like that. Then I remembered the brochures in my dresser and Jessica's voice in the hallway saying, "Use that. She trusts you." Nothing about caution felt silly after that. From the bank I drove to a small storage facility on the edge of town and rented a climate-controlled unit no bigger than a walk-in closet. That afternoon, while Jessica was at a lunch meeting and Ryan was at work, I began carrying things out of the house, one tote bag at a time. Not furniture, nothing obvious, only the irreplaceable. Daniel's watch box, our wedding album, the old leather portfolio containing our wills and trust documents, the deed records from Florida, my mother's pearl earrings, 3 framed family photographs Jessica had shoved into the cabinet months before, a set of handwritten recipes in my grandmother's cursive, the blue ceramic bowl Daniel always used for pistachios during football games, small things maybe to an outsider. To me, they were the last intact pieces of a life I would not let be boxed up as clutter or sold off on social media by a woman who thought emotional history was an interior design problem. Each trip to the car felt like theater. I would leave by the side door with a tote or file bin pulse hammering, then drive to the storage unit and place each item carefully inside as if I were laying parts of myself in protective custody. By the third trip, I had a rhythm. By the fifth, I had stopped feeling foolish. I was not sneaking. I was securing evidence of my own existence. Harold and I spoke every other day that week. He was methodical, never emotional, and I came to depend on that steadiness. "Have you moved your key documents?" he asked during one call. "Yes. Any financial accounts they can access, not directly. But Ryan knows where my primary statements used to be mailed. Change the address." I did. "Any sentimental property you'd regret losing if they became destructive after notice?" I looked around my room while he asked it. "Some." "Then keep going," he said. Quietly. That word quietly became my operating principle. What I had not expected was how much more I would see once I stopped performing normalcy in my own head. Ryan and Jessica thought I was still wounded, still passive, still retreating inward after the argument in the kitchen. Jessica especially seemed to interpret my silence as collapse. She moved through the house with a renewed confidence, like a woman who believed the balance of power had finally settled where it belonged. Ryan avoided me more than before, which hurt, though I no longer let the hurt govern my decisions. He started leaving earlier and coming home later. At dinner, if we all ate together, he kept conversation on safe topics: traffic, weather, sports, some new development near his office. He behaved the way people do when they are hoping discomfort can be outweighed. But once you learn to watch, avoidance is very loud. One evening, he left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower upstairs. I had no intention of touching it. Truly. But the screen lit up with a preview notification from a contact labeled simply, "Aunt Cheryl." "Is your mom really forgetting things that badly?" I stared at the screen without moving. A second message appeared moments later. "Your cousin said you sounded worried." My hand tightened around the dish towel I was holding. I did not pick up the phone. I did not need to. The previews alone told me enough. Ryan had not merely repeated Jessica's little insinuations inside the house. He had begun carrying that version of me outward into the family, forgetting things that badly. Sounded worried. He was laying kindling. That night, after both of them went to bed, I sat at my desk and wrote down every detail I could remember from the messages. Then I added a note beneath them. "He is preparing witnesses." The next few days confirmed it. Jessica mentioned with fake casualness that one of her friends had found a wonderful active adult community for her own mother. Ryan asked whether I wanted him to simplify some of my recurring bills because paperwork gets overwhelming. At church that Sunday, a woman I barely knew touched my arm and said, "Ryan loves you so much. He's just worried you're carrying too much by yourself right now." I smiled politely while something cold moved through me. That was the danger of a quiet character assassination. It did not arrive as one dramatic lie. It arrived as concern, as context, as soft framing. By the time a woman realizes people are looking at her through that lens, they have often already adjusted their sympathy to fit the story someone else told first. On Tuesday afternoon, the worst confirmation came. I had gone upstairs to return a folded blanket to the linen closet outside Ryan and Jessica's room. Their bedroom door was partially open, and I could hear Ryan inside on speakerphone with someone, male voice, older, maybe one of his cousins or a friend from church. "I'm not saying she's gone," Ryan was saying. "I'm saying she's not herself lately." I stopped breathing. Then he continued lower now. No diagnosis. Just confusion. Emotional swings. Trouble letting go of things. Jess and I are trying to be patient. I stood in that hallway with a blanket in my hands and felt the full obscenity of it settle over me. He was not just excusing his own behavior, he was laundering it, turning his betrayal into concern before an audience, making future resistance from me easier to dismiss. I backed away before he could step out and see me. Downstairs, I sat in my room in complete stillness for several minutes, then picked up the phone and called Harold. When he answered, I did not waste time. "He's telling people I'm declining," I said. Harold was quiet a beat. "Do you have specifics?" "Yes." I told him about the text previews from Aunt Cheryl, about the church comment, about the call I had just overheard. "That's useful," he said. I almost laughed from disbelief. "Useful, yes," he said calmly. "Painful but useful. It supports the pattern. The pattern." That phrase saved me from despair more than once. Because patterns can be documented, patterns can be challenged, patterns can be exposed, individual moments can be denied, a pattern cannot. Harold told me to keep a log with dates, witnesses, exact wording when possible. He also advised me to avoid any emotional confrontation that could later be twisted into evidence of instability. Do not give them scenes, he said. Give me facts. So I did. I logged Jessica's comments about memory slips, Ryan's call upstairs, the churchwoman's remark, the brochures, the text previews. Their repeated references to needing space, simplifying things, helping me manage. Every entry made me sadder and stronger at the same time. By then, my move was also taking shape in more practical ways. Through a referral from a woman at church I trusted, I found a short-term furnished cottage in a quiet community near Asheville, small, clean, private, with a screened porch and enough room for me to breathe. I toured it one Friday morning while pretending to Jessica I had a lunch date with an old Florida friend passing through town. The cottage had white curtains, a maple tree out front, and a narrow bookshelf built into the living room wall. When I stepped inside, I felt something I had not felt in that big house for months. Relief. Not joy, not yet, but the possibility of safety. I put down a deposit from the new checking account and arranged for move-in 2 weeks later. As everything began quietly aligning the account, the storage unit, the cottage, the legal file, the growing evidence of their narrative, I found myself thinking often about Daniel. Not in the helpless way grief first arrives, but like a companion whose lessons were finally being used. He had always hated vagueness in financial matters, hated assumptions, hated the way good people sometimes believed love itself was a contract. Trust people, Bonnie, he used to say, but never more than the paperwork does. I had failed at that once already. I would not fail again. By the end of the week, I had secured what mattered most, documented more than Ryan or Jessica realized, and built the beginnings of an exit they did not see coming. The woman who had cried behind a locked bedroom door after being told to pack her bags was still in me, still hurt, still grieving, still stunned by the shape of my son's betrayal. But alongside her now stood someone else, someone organized, someone alert, someone no longer trying to save the illusion of family at the expense of herself. And as I sat that Saturday evening in my room sealing one more envelope of copied records for Harold, I understood that selling the house was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming a plan. Not because I wanted to destroy Ryan, not because Jessica deserved some dramatic punishment, but because they had already made their intention clear: remove me, rewrite me, use the property, move on. They thought they were preparing the ground beneath my feet to give way. What they did not know, what neither of them even suspected, was that I had already found the fault line under theirs. The house went on the market on a Wednesday. Not publicly at first, not in the full dramatic way people imagine when they think of a house sale. There was no giant sign planted in the yard at dawn, no immediate parade of strangers tromping through the front hallway. Megan Cole was too smart for that, and Harold was too careful. The first steps were quiet. Photographs were scheduled discreetly. Listing language was prepared in advance. The legal notice was drafted and held until the precise moment it would do the most damage and give Ryan and Jessica the least room to scramble. That was the part that surprised me most once I was inside it. Justice, when done properly, can look very calm. Megan met me for coffee 3 days before the listing went live. She was in her 40s, elegant without being flashy, with dark hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck and the kind of focused expression that told me she had seen every type of family conflict money could create. Harold gave me the essentials, she said, stirring her coffee once and setting the spoon down with exactness. I understand discretion matters. It does, I said. She studied me for a moment. And I understand this is not just a transaction. No, I thought. It was not. She asked practical questions. Condition of the home, likely buyer profile, timing, access, showing strategy. But beneath each question was a quiet competence that kept me from feeling foolish or melodramatic. She did not ask whether I was sure. She did not make sympathetic noises that would have reduced the whole thing to wounded pride. She treated it as what it was, a legal and logistical reality that needed to be managed cleanly. When I finished outlining the situation, she nodded once. In this neighborhood, she said, if the home is priced correctly and marketed well, interest will be immediate. Immediate. The word sent a small, fierce current through me. Good, I said. We arranged the photographer for the following Monday morning during a window when Jessica had a branding meeting for the boutique and Ryan was due at the office. Megan's team would enter with a lockbox Harold had authorized, move quickly, and leave no trace beyond the unsettling feeling that something had shifted inside the house. By then, I had already signed the documents Harold prepared. I had already finalized the cottage lease. I had already moved enough of my meaningful belongings that if the walls suddenly erupted around me, I would not lose the parts of my life I could not replace. All that remained was the moment of revelation. And that, as it turned out, arrived in stages. Monday morning began with Jessica standing in the kitchen in a crisp ivory blouse complaining into her phone about fabric delays and custom packaging. Ryan had left early again. I kept my expression neutral while she moved around the island with the clipped efficiency of a woman who believed she still controlled the center of the room. I may be back late, she said, not looking at me. A lot going on. I sipped my coffee. All right, that was all. No sharpness, no challenge, nothing to signal what would happen the moment her car left the driveway. At 1012, Megan's photographer arrived. He was a polite young man, with shoe covers, a rolling camera case, and the kind of detached professionalism that made him invisible if you wanted him to be. Megan came too just for the first 15 minutes, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a tablet. I met them at the side door, heart pounding so hard I thought I might have to sit down. "You doing okay?" Megan asked quietly. I nodded. Yes. It was not entirely true, but it was true enough. They worked fast. Wide shots of the kitchen. Living room. Exterior, upstairs bedrooms, my suite, backyard, front porch. Megan had a knack for shifting details an inch or two to make everything look brighter, more balanced, more desirable. She straightened a throw pillow, opened a blind, removed a soap dispenser from the bathroom sink. I stood in my room while they photographed the downstairs suite and had the strangest feeling that I was watching a stage set being documented before the actors knew the show had been canceled. When they left, the house looked almost untouched. Almost. But I could feel the difference in the air, like static before a storm. The listing was uploaded Wednesday morning at 9:03 a.m. Harold emailed me the final live link. At 9:07, my phone buzzed again. "Megan, we're active." Already getting inquiries. At 9:21, Jessica texted me from upstairs even though we were in the same house. "Did someone come in here this week?" I stared at the message for a full 5 seconds before answering. Yes, nothing more. A minute later, she came downstairs in a rush, phone in hand, face pale beneath her makeup. "Why is there a lockbox on the side door?" she demanded. I set my book down with deliberate care. "Because the house is for sale." She actually laughed. It was the same disbelieving sound she had made when I spoke of sacrifice in the kitchen weeks earlier. But this time, the laugh was thinner, fractured at the edges. "What? The house is for sale," I repeated. Her expression shifted not yet into panic, not fully, but into the first raw recognition that reality had moved without her permission. "You're joking." "I'm not." She took 2 steps toward me. "You can't do that." There is a particular calm that comes when you speak from ground someone else did not know you still held. "Yes," I said, "I can." She stared at me, searching my face for uncertainty and finding none. Then she looked down at her phone, thumbs flying. "Ryan," she muttered. "Oh my God. Ryan." He arrived home 25 minutes later. I heard the garage door slam harder than usual, then his footsteps down the hall. When he came into the kitchen, his face was flushed, his tie loosened, one hand still gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "Mom," he said. That one word carried anger, confusion, accusation, fear. I turned from the sink where I had been rinsing my teacup. Yes, his eyes searched mine. "Why is our house on Zillow? Our house?" Even then, I dried my hands slowly on a towel. "Because it's being sold." Jessica made a strangled sound behind him. "Tell her she can't do this." Ryan ignored her, still looking at me. "What is this?" I held his gaze. "This is the consequence of telling me to leave a home I helped pay for." His jaw tightened. "Mom, stop talking in riddles." I almost smiled at that, though there was no humor in me. "I'm not talking in riddles, Ryan. You and your wife made your position clear, so I made mine." Jessica stepped forward, then voice rising. "You vindictive old..." Ryan threw up a hand without taking his eyes off me. "Jess! Stop!" It was the first time I had heard him try to stop her at all. Too late, of course. But notable. He looked back at me. Who did this, Harold? Harold reviewed the paperwork. Ryan's face changed at that. Something in it tightened with memory, closing, documents, signatures, terms he had clearly never bothered to understand properly. I watched the realization move across him in pieces. Confusion first, then calculation, then fear. You talked to a lawyer before talking to me, he asked. I let the silence answer for a moment before I spoke. You stopped being someone I could safely talk to quite some time ago. That hit him. I saw it. Jessica, on the other hand, had moved beyond shock into fury. This is insane, she snapped. You're trying to destroy us. No, I said. I'm protecting myself. Her mouth fell open in disbelief, as though self-protection were somehow an outrageous concept when practiced by someone she had already categorized as weak. Ryan dragged a hand over his face. Mom, just tell me exactly what you think is happening here. That sentence nearly took my breath away. Not because it was cruel, because it was so nakedly dishonest. As if the brochures, the whispers, the calls to relatives, the kitchen confrontation, Jessica's laughter and his silence had all happened in some fog of innocent misunderstanding. I looked at my son, really looked at him, at the tension around his eyes, at the fear beginning to sweat through his anger, at the man who had once known the sound of my voice in the dark and come running now, standing in front of me, asking what I thought was happening. So I answered plainly. I think you believed I was too lonely, too heartbroken, and too trusting to notice what you and Jessica were doing. I think you assumed you could push me out, frame it as concern, and use this house to solve your financial problems. Jessica sucked in a breath. Ryan went white. For one beat, no one spoke. Then Ryan said, "That's not fair." Fair? I almost laughed then, but what came out instead was something colder. Fair, I said. Your wife told me to pack my bags. You stood there and said maybe distance would be good for everyone. If you're looking for fairness, Ryan, you should have started there. Jessica's voice came sharp and desperate now. This house is our future. And there it was. No polish, no euphemism, no family language, just truth exposed and ugly. I turned to her. No, it is a property you thought you could leverage after you got rid of me. Ryan slammed his phone down on the counter hard enough to make me jump. What do you want? He demanded. The answer came from somewhere deeper than anger. I want what's legally mine, and I want out of this house on terms you do not control. He stared at me. Jessica looked as if she might either scream or collapse. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Megan, 4 showing requests, 1 likely serious buyer. I set the phone face down on the counter. Ryan noticed anyway. Are there already people interested? Yes. Jessica let out a strangled curse and gripped the back of a chair. No, 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 no. I looked at both of them, and in that moment the entire balance of the house shifted so completely it was almost visible. For months they had used uncertainty as a weapon against me. Now uncertainty belonged to them. When I spoke again, my voice was quiet. You told me to pack my bags, I said. So I decided I wasn't the one who should leave empty-handed. Neither of them answered. For the first time since I moved to North Carolina, the silence in that house did not belong to my pain. It belonged to their panic. And somewhere beneath the heartbreak, beneath the grief, beneath everything they had taken from me already, I felt the first clean edge of emotional justice begin to arrive. Panic reveals character faster than comfort ever does. The moment Ryan and Jessica understood the sale was real, they did what desperate people always do when control slips through their fingers. They tried every version of pressure they had left. Jessica started with rage. I cannot believe this, she snapped, pacing across the kitchen like a woman trying to outrun the collapse happening inside her own chest. You have completely lost your mind. I stood by the sink, one hand resting lightly on the counter. No, I've finally found it. That only made her more furious. Ryan, for his part, was still trying to regain his footing. I could see him sorting through possibilities at lightning speed, some legal loophole he had forgotten, some technicality Harold had missed, some way to recast me as irrational and himself as the injured party. He looked less like my son in that moment than like a man watching a floor plan catch fire while insisting there had to be another exit somewhere. Mom, he said, voice tighter, now before this goes any further, we need to sit down and talk like adults. Like adults. The phrase was almost insulting in its absurdity considering what had brought us there. I have tried to live like an adult in this house, I said. I'm not the one who turned manipulation into a household system. Jessica spun toward Ryan. Why are you talking to her like this is negotiable? Call someone. Call the attorney. Call whoever. Harold is the attorney, I said. She stared at me as if I had slapped her. That was the first truly satisfying moment, I admit it. Not because I enjoyed her fear exactly, but because for once the facts were stronger than her performance. Ryan dragged out a chair and sat heavily, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed to his forehead. Okay, he muttered. Okay. Let's just slow down. No, Jessica snapped. We do not need to slow down. We need to stop this. Then she turned on me fully. You are destroying your own son, she said. For a split second, the sentence stung. Not because it was true, but because mothers are conditioned to flinch whenever our children are framed as the ones being harmed. It is one of the oldest levers in the world, and people like Jessica know exactly where to press. But by then I had become too familiar with her methods to mistake manipulation for pain. No, I said again very calmly. Your choices are destroying him. I'm just no longer covering the cost. Ryan looked up then, and something in my tone must have landed more deeply than the words themselves because his face tightened. You think this is about money? He asked. I held his gaze. I think this has always been about money. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked away. Jessica stepped closer to the table, palms flat against the wood. You don't know anything about our finances. That was the mistake. The moment she denied what had already been written across every overdue envelope, every late-night argument, every whisper about refinancing and breathing room, I know enough, I said. Enough to recognize desperation when I hear it through a hallway wall. Her expression changed, just for a second, a flicker. But it was enough. Ryan saw it too. What did you hear? He asked sharply. I did not answer immediately. I wanted them to sit in the uncertainty for one moment longer, the same way they had let me sit in confusion and self-doubt for months. Then I said, I heard your wife say the sooner I was out, the sooner you could refinance and breathe. Silence. Jessica's shoulders went rigid. Ryan turned toward her slowly. Jess, he said. She lifted her chin. So what if I said it? It was true. There was something almost breathtaking about her refusal to hide at that point. When a person has lived too long in entitlement, exposure can feel less shaming than surrender. Jessica had spent months translating cruelty into efficiency, greed into practicality, erasure into household order. Now that the mask had slipped, she seemed to prefer being openly hard rather than having to retreat into softness. We are in trouble, she said, looking directly at Ryan now instead of me. We have been in trouble. And everyone has been pretending we're supposed to tiptoe around that while she takes up an entire wing of this house and acts like her grief gives her final say over everything. My grief. As if widowhood were some decorative excuse I had hung around my shoulders for attention. Ryan stood up so quickly the chair legs scraped hard against the floor. That's not helping. No, what's not helping is that you let this get to this point, Jessica fired back. You kept saying you'd handle it. You kept saying she trusted you. You kept saying we just needed a little more time. Ryan flinched. I watched his face as she spoke, and there it was, the thing I had waited months to see clearly. Not remorse. Not yet. But shame. Naked, unwilling, impossible to hide. He had told her I trusted him. He had discussed me like a problem to be managed. He had given her confidence because he had never truly believed I would step outside the role they had assigned me. That realization hurt in a new way, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something uglier than weakness, contempt, not just greed, not just avoidance, contempt for my softness, contempt for the very qualities that had once made me a good mother. Ryan turned back to me, his voice lower now. Mom, I know this looks bad. Looks bad. There is a kind of sentence that reveals more than a confession ever could. Looks bad is what a man says when he still hopes appearances are the main problem. No, I said quietly. It is bad. Jessica laughed bitterly. This is unbelievable. We took you in. That one sentence stripped the rest of my restraint clean away. You took me in, I repeated. She crossed her arms. Yes. I felt my whole body go still. I sold my home in Florida, I said. I put the largest share of liquid money into this property. I uprooted my life while grieving my husband because my son told me I would still have a family. And you are standing in front of me saying you took me in, her mouth tightened but she said nothing. Ryan tried again more carefully this time. Mom, whatever happened, selling the house doesn't solve it. That was the closest he had come to honesty all day. No, I said, it reveals it. He stared at me. I stepped closer to the table, not aggressive, just clear. You want to know what this solves? It solves the lie that I am powerless here. It solves the fantasy that I can be humiliated, pushed aside, spoken about like I'm deteriorating, and still be expected to quietly step aside for your convenience. His eyes widened slightly at that. I never said you were deteriorating. I held his gaze until he looked away. You told people I wasn't myself, I said. You let your wife talk about memory slips and neurologists. You let relatives believe I was becoming confused. His silence answered me before his mouth did. I was worried, he said at last. No, I replied. You were preparing the story you'd need if I resisted. Jessica opened her mouth to interrupt, but for the first time, Ryan turned sharply toward her. Stop, he said. The word cracked across the room. She blinked. Excuse me, I said, stop. For a moment, neither of them seemed to know what to do with that. Jessica, because she was unused to being checked. Ryan, because he was unused to doing it. Then he looked back at me and his face had changed. Not enough to redeem anything, but enough for me to see the strain beneath the anger. We didn't mean for it to get like this, he said. I almost smiled at the weakness of it. No one ever does, I said. That's the luxury of moral collapse. It arrives one excuse at a time. He exhaled hard, pacing away from the table now. You don't understand the pressure we've been under. I understand it perfectly, I said. What I don't accept is your belief that pressure absolves character. Jessica snorted. Easy to say when you're not the one drowning. I turned to her. I am not the reason you are drowning. That landed too. Maybe because it was simple. Maybe because it was undeniable. Ryan ran both hands through his hair. So what now? We just lose the house. There it was again. The real wound. Not family, not trust, not love. The house. You chose to gamble your decency against a property you didn't control, I said. That was your mistake, not mine. Jessica's eyes flashed. You are enjoying this. The accusation surprised me enough that I answered honestly. No, I said, I'm grieving it, but I'm not stopping it. That was the difference she could not understand. To someone like Jessica, boundaries always look like aggression when they finally arrive. By evening, the panic shifted forms. The anger cooled just enough for begging to begin. Ryan came to my room first, knocking softly. Can I come in? I should have said no. Instead, I said, you can stand there. He opened the door and remained near the threshold as if even he sensed he no longer belonged fully inside my space. I know I failed you, he said. I looked at him and saw how exhausted he truly was. The lines around his mouth, the slump in his shoulders, the brittle fragility of a man who had built his life on delay avoidance and the assumption that emotional debts could always be postponed until later. Yes, I said. He swallowed. But selling the house will ruin us. Ruin us. Again, not I'm sorry. Not first. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap. Ryan, I said, you keep talking as if ruin only begins when consequences arrive. It began the moment you decided my trust was something you could spend. His eyes filled then, and I wish I could say that softened me. It did a little. I am not stone. I am his mother. But pain in a grown man does not undo the choices that created it. I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought you'd never go this far. And there it was, the deepest betrayal of all. Not just that he had hurt me, that he had counted on my goodness as a strategic weakness. I held his gaze and spoke the truest thing I had said in months. That is exactly why you are here. He stood very still. Behind him in the hallway, I could hear Jessica moving, restless and furious, opening drawers, shutting cabinets, making noise because she did not know what else to do with a world that had stopped obeying her. Ryan looked as though he might say something else, but whatever it was died on the way up. He nodded once, a small broken motion, and stepped back. When the door closed, I sat in the quiet and let the moment settle through me. Months earlier, I might have mistaken his tears for redemption. Now I knew better. Regret is not repentance. Fear is not love. And being sorry you miscalculated is not the same as being sorry you were cruel. By the time the house grew silent that night, one thing had become clear in a way even Ryan could no longer avoid. The worst part of what he had done was not that he wanted the house. It was that he truly believed I would go on choosing peace no matter what it cost me. He had mistaken my gentleness for surrender. And now, for the first time in his life, my son was learning that a woman can remain decent and still become immovable. The sale moved faster than any of us expected. That was partly the market, of course. Megan had been right about the neighborhood. The house sat in one of those desirable pockets outside Asheville where good school zones, mature trees, and wide lots made buyers move quickly when something clean and updated became available. But speed also came from something else, something almost symbolic. Once the truth was exposed, it was as if the house itself no longer wished to hold us together. Within 4 days of the listing going live, Megan had multiple strong offers. By the end of the first week, there were 2 serious buyers competing. By the middle of the second, we were under contract. I still remember the exact afternoon Megan called. I was sitting in my cottage parking lot, engine off, having just returned from dropping another load at the storage unit. She spoke in the brisk, measured tone she always used when she had good news wrapped in practicalities. "We have a clean offer above asking," she said. "Strong financing, flexible closing, short contingency period. Harold's reviewing the terms now, but from a market standpoint, this is exactly what we wanted." I closed my eyes for a moment. Above asking. Clean. Flexible. The language of property is so clinical, and yet every word landed inside me like a bell. Not because I cared about winning in some flashy way. I did not. But because the speed of it made one fact impossible for Ryan and Jessica to deny this was happening. Not as a threat, not as a bluff, not as some emotional outburst they could wait out until I softened. As reality. When I got back to the house that evening, Ryan was in the kitchen alone. He looked up the moment I walked in, and I could tell from his face he already knew. "Is it true?" he asked. I set my purse down on the chair by the door. "Yes." His shoulders dropped slightly, not in relief but in surrender to a fact he no longer had the energy to fight. How long, 30-day close, assuming everything stays on track? He stared at the countertop for a long time before speaking again. "That's soon." I thought of all the weeks they had spent trying to accelerate my disappearance. The brochures, the whispers, the little campaign of concern. The plan had been acceptable when the urgency was mine to endure. "Yes," I said. "It is." Jessica, unsurprisingly, did not take the news with even Ryan's fragile version of composure. She came in 20 minutes later, carrying shopping bags and talking on her phone, then stopped dead when she saw us both in the kitchen. "What now?" she asked, reading the room instantly. Ryan didn't answer. He just looked at me. I did not make her wait. "We're under contract." For a second, she simply stood there. Then she dropped the shopping bags onto the floor so hard that a cosmetics box rolled out and hit the cabinet toe kick. "No," she said. "No greeting, no question. Just refusal, as if reality could still be vetoed through volume." "Yes," I said. "No." She took 3 quick steps into the room, eyes flashing, hands already opening and closing at her sides. "You did this to punish us." I had been waiting for some version of that accusation. "I did this," I said, "because you made it clear there was no safe future for me in this house." Her laugh was wild now, frayed around the edges. "Safe. From what? Me asking for boundaries, me asking for order, me trying to build a life with my husband while you turned every conversation into some tragedy about yourself." Ryan flinched at that, but she was too far gone to notice. "I gave you far more grace than you gave me," I said. Jessica pointed toward the hallway, toward my room, toward all the spaces she had spent months trying to redefine around me. "We let you live here." The sentence no longer cut me the way it once had. By then, it had become almost useful, a final summary of everything she truly believed. "No," I replied. "You misread the arrangement and mistook my patience for surrender." Ryan sank into a chair and covered his mouth with one hand. Jessica rounded on him immediately. "Do not sit there like this is over." He looked up exhausted. "What do you want me to do, Jess? Fight?" With what there was the problem, plain and ugly. They had run out of substance, no hidden legal ace, no forgotten paperwork, no magical technicality, only anger and consequences. Jessica stared at him as if his fatigue were a personal betrayal. Then she turned back to me and the tone changed. That was the next phase. Begging. Not sincere begging, not at first. Tactical begging. Desperation dressed as emotional reason. "Bonnie," she said, and hearing my name in that softened voice felt more chilling than all her sharpness. "Let's just take a breath and think about what this really means. For all of us." I almost admired her flexibility. For all of us, I repeated. Yes. She moved closer, palms open now, her face arranged into something almost vulnerable. This is a family home. We've all made mistakes. Emotions got high. Things were said. But selling the house, this is nuclear. Nuclear. I thought of being told to pack my bags in the kitchen. I thought of hearing her say the sooner I was out, the sooner they could refinance and breathe. I thought of Ryan telling other people I was not myself anymore. And I thought, no. The explosion happened long before the fire reached your side of the walls. You should have considered all that I said quietly before deciding I was disposable. Her eyes hardened again. The softness fell away. Ryan stood then, pushing his chair back with a scraping sound. "Stop," he said. Jessica swung toward him. "What? Just stop." The room went silent. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Not because of the lines in his face, because denial had finally become too expensive to keep carrying. "She's not changing her mind," he said. Jessica's mouth fell open. "You're giving up." He let out one short, broken laugh. "Jess, there's nothing left to give up. It's done." I watched them both then with a strange ache in my chest. Months earlier, I had imagined emotional justice as something cleaner, more satisfying, more cinematic perhaps. I thought if the day ever came when the balance of power flipped, I would feel triumphant. Instead, what I felt was grief with structure. Yes, there was vindication in seeing them finally understand what they had done. Yes, there was relief in not being the frightened one anymore. But underneath both was something sadder, the knowledge that this was my family collapsing in plain sight, and no one in that kitchen was innocent enough anymore to put it back together. A few days later, Harold formally arranged the occupancy timeline. Because I still had enough decency not to become what they had been to me, I agreed to a short, lawful grace period that gave all of us time to move without theatrical cruelty. I did not throw their things onto the lawn. I did not cut off utilities. I did not demand they be gone in 48 hours just because I finally could have exercised hard power. Instead, I did what they never did for me. I used leverage without humiliation. Megan's buyer agreed to a closing date that gave us just enough room. My cottage would be ready before then. Ryan and Jessica had enough notice to secure a rental if they moved quickly. Harold even provided a list of short-term options in the area through a relocation contact. When I handed Ryan the printout, he looked at it, then looked at me. "You already did the research." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "Why?" "Because I refused to rot from the inside the way you did," I thought. Aloud, I said, "Because consequences don't require cruelty." That nearly broke him. Not dramatically. Ryan had become too emotionally cramped for big, visible breakdowns. But I saw it in the way his mouth tightened and his eyes went wet and then looked away. Jessica, on the other hand, took my restraint as one final insult. She spent the next week moving through the house like someone forced to breathe underwater. Cabinet doors slammed, closets opened and shut, cardboard boxes appeared. Every sound of packing seemed to echo the opening line of the story they had tried to write for me. "Pack your bags." Only now it was her handbag on the counter, her shoes lined by the garage, her dresses coming off the upstairs racks, her framed wedding photos wrapped in newspaper. There was a bitter symmetry to it that I could not ignore. One afternoon I came into the dining room and found her aggressively taping boxes while muttering under her breath. She looked up the instant she felt me there. "You must be loving this," she said. "No," I answered honestly. "I'm just no longer stopping it." She stared at me, waiting for more, some speech, some confession of triumph, some cruel little flourish she could hold up later as proof that I had finally become the villain she needed. I gave her none. That seemed to infuriate her more than shouting would have. Ryan packed differently, slowly, quietly, like a man handling not just objects but evidence of his own failures. One evening I passed the open door of the upstairs guest room and saw him sitting on the floor with an old baseball glove in his hands, staring at it with the blank, haunted expression of someone who has finally realized memory will not testify in his favor. For a second I almost stopped, almost said his name the way I used to when he was little and ashamed, but motherhood, I had learned by then, is not the same thing as rescue. So I kept walking. The final week before closing was full of small, practical humiliations that belonged more to reality than revenge. Change of address forms, utility transfers, scheduling movers, sorting what fit in the rental and what had to go to storage. The ordinary mechanics of leaving a place all of us had once imagined would anchor our future. Only now that future had split open, and still I did not waver. Not because it was easy, because by then I understood what wavering would cost. Not just money, not just security, self-respect. The night before Ryan and Jessica were due to move into their rental, I stood alone in the downstairs sitting area and looked around at the room where Daniel's chair had once stood before Jessica banished it to the garage. I had already arranged for the chair to be delivered to the cottage the following week. That thought comforted me more than it should have. Some things, when reclaimed, feel larger than furniture. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Ryan stood in the doorway, one hand in his pocket, shoulders slumped. "We got the keys," he said. I nodded. "All right." He hesitated. "We'll be mostly out by tomorrow night." Again, I nodded. He stayed there another moment as if waiting for absolution to materialize from the silence. It did not. Finally, he said, "I never thought it would come to this." That was the closest he had come to saying the truth without hiding behind logistics. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the child I had raised, but the man he had chosen to become. Weak where he should have been brave. Quiet where he should have spoken. Sorry only after the price became unavoidable. "No," I said gently. "You didn't." He lowered his head. And in that moment I understood something that gave me more peace than anger ever could. I had won without becoming smaller. They were the ones packing their bags. They were the ones leaving the house. They were the ones forced to reckon with what they had done. And I had done it without screaming, without stooping, without turning my pain into spectacle. The justice of it was not loud. It was steadier than that. It looked like boxes at the door, like a signed contract on a kitchen counter, like a son facing the wreckage of his own character, like a mother who finally understood that love without boundaries is not virtue, it is an invitation to be erased. And I was no longer available for that. I moved into the cottage on a rainy Tuesday morning in early November. The timing felt almost theatrical, though no one had arranged it that way. The sky was pale and low, the road slick with a cold drizzle, and the maple tree outside my new front porch had already shed half its leaves. They lay in wet red clumps along the walkway like little surrendered flames. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside with my purse and overnight bag, the silence that greeted me was not empty in the way silence had been after Daniel died. It was clean. That is the best word I have for it. Not joyful. Not triumphant. Not even peaceful exactly. Just clean. No sharpened tones drifting from another room. No undercurrent of impatience in the kitchen. No tension waiting at the top of the stairs. No need to listen through walls for evidence of my own erasure. Just stillness. The movers brought in the essentials. First, my bed, the little writing desk, 2 lamps, several kitchen boxes, and Daniel's recliner, which looked almost absurdly large in the cottage living room, and yet instantly made the place feel inhabited by someone real. I stood with a mug of lukewarm coffee while they arranged things and thought, so this is what it feels like to enter a home and not have to negotiate your right to exist in it. The cottage sat in a small community just outside Asheville, mostly women my age and older. A few widowers, 1 retired school principal, and a former nurse named Lorraine, who lived 2 doors down and somehow knew my name before I had even livingtoned. Unpacked the dish towels. "If you need anything," she said that first afternoon, leaning under a cheerful umbrella and pointing down the lane, "we've got coffee on Thursdays, prayer circle on Mondays, and enough opinions around here to solve every world problem except the ones on television." I laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. That was how healing began for me. Not in some dramatic sunrise moment, not in a speech, not in the satisfying collapse of the people who had hurt me. It began with ordinary kindness that did not ask anything in return. During the first week, I moved slowly, 1 box at a time, 1 drawer, 1 shelf. I hung my blue quilt at the foot of the bed, set Daniel's framed photograph on the dresser, and arranged my grandmother's handwritten recipes in the kitchen drawer nearest the stove. I bought a rosemary plant for the porch and 2 new mugs because something in me wanted proof that not everything in my life was salvage work. Some things could simply be new. I also joined things I would once have dismissed as not really my style. A widow's support circle at a nearby church, a Wednesday lunch group at the community center, A gentle stretching class where women in soft sneakers talked more than they stretched, and no one seemed to mind. At first I went because I knew isolation had made me vulnerable once already, and I did not trust myself to disappear quietly into solitude. But after a while I went because these women made room for each other in ways I had forgotten were possible. Nobody treated grief like an inconvenience. Nobody translated pain into burden. We told the truth in pieces, and those pieces held. One Thursday after coffee, a woman named June, white-haired, elegant, with the dry humor of a former English teacher, said something that settled into me so deeply, I wrote it down later on a receipt in my purse. "You can survive loneliness," she said, stirring cream into her cup. "What nearly kills you is being lonely in the presence of people who owe you love." I sat with that for days. Because that had been the real injury, hadn't it? Not just that Ryan and Jessica had used me. Not even just that they wanted the house. It was that I had been made to feel alone while sitting right there inside what was supposed to be family. The sale closed 3 weeks after I moved into the cottage. I did not go to the house that day. Harold handled the legal side. Megan handled the buyer logistics. My remaining belongings had already been delivered, and I had no interest in standing in a driveway watching the final transfer like a spectator at my own emotional autopsy. Instead, I sat on my little screened porch with a blanket over my knees and a cup of tea in my hands, while rain tapped softly on the railing and the trees behind the community swayed in the November wind. At 6 p.m., Harold called. "It's done," he said. I closed my eyes. Done. That one word carried months inside it. Grief, insult, discovery, documents, resolve, boxes, silence, loss. Relief. "Thank you," I said. He was quiet for a beat. "Then, you did the hard part, Bonnie." After I hung up, I sat there for a long time and let the moment move through me without trying to shape it into something neat. There were tears, yes, but not the helpless kind. These were different. Tears for the life I thought I was moving into when I left Florida. Tears for Daniel, who should have been the one growing old beside me, instead of becoming the standard by which every new disappointment was measured. Tears for Ryan, too, though I hated admitting that at first. Because loving your child after they betray you does not make you weak. It makes the grief more complicated. Winter settled in gently after that. The kind of North Carolina winter that never quite commits to harshness, but still makes you earn each warm morning. I developed routines. Sunday church, Tuesday grocery trips, Thursday coffee, evening walks when the weather allowed. I started cooking properly again, not because anyone expected dinner on the table, but because feeding myself began to feel like a form of respect instead of mere maintenance. People often imagine empowerment as loud. Mine became quiet. It looked like paying my own bills at the kitchen counter without fear. It looked like choosing curtains because I liked the color, not because they matched someone else's aesthetic. It looked like waking up and not bracing for disrespect. And then in late February, Ryan came to see me. He did not call first. I was trimming rosemary on the porch when I saw his car pull slowly into the guest parking area across the lane. For a second, I thought maybe I was mistaken. But then he stepped out, closed the door, and stood there with both hands in his coat pockets, as if he were not entirely sure he had the right to come any closer. He looked thinner, not dramatically, just hollowed out around the face in the way people do when the life they built turns out to have no interior support. I set the herb shears down on the porch table and waited. He walked up the path slowly. "Hi, Mom," he said. There are greetings that sound simple and greetings that arrive carrying the weight of ruin. That one was the second kind. Ryan. He glanced around the porch, the potted plants, the white rocking chair, the basket of kindling by the door. "This is nice." "It is." He nodded once. "Can I talk to you? I should tell you I did not rush to open the door. I did not say, 'Of course, sweetheart, come in.' I did not melt because he looked tired. That version of me, the woman who heard need in her son's voice and immediately reorganized her own pain around it, was gone, or at least transformed enough to stand back and wait. "You can sit," I said, gesturing to the other rocking chair. He sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Wind moved lightly through the trees behind the cottages. Somewhere down the lane, a screen door shut and someone laughed. Finally, Ryan said Jessica left. I looked at him steadily. When, a month ago, I nodded once, not out of surprise, but because the timing made sense. Houses reveal character, but losing them reveals it further. Jessica had wanted security status, leverage control. Once the house was gone and the debt remained, so did the truth of what she was loyal to. She moved in with a friend at first, he continued, then with her sister in Charlotte. She says she needs space, time, perspective. He gave a short, humorless laugh. A lot of the words I used on you, I guess. I said nothing. He stared down at his hands. The boutique's basically done. I'm in a rental I can barely afford. Half the furniture's in storage. He stopped and swallowed hard. I've had a lot of time to think. There it was. The line every wounded parent waits for and dreads at once, because thought is not the same as change, and regret is not always evidence of conscience. Sometimes it is just what remains after comfort leaves. He looked up at me then, and his eyes were red-rimmed in the way of a man who had probably practiced being composed all morning and failed halfway through the drive. I was wrong, he said. I held his gaze. Yes, I answered. Some people would call that cold. It wasn't. It was honest. He did not need me to rescue him from the truth of his own sentence. Ryan nodded faintly as if he had expected no other answer and perhaps deserved none kinder. I let her shape everything he said. At first I thought I was just keeping the peace. Then I started telling myself we were under pressure, that it was temporary, that once we got through the financial mess I'd fix it with you somehow. He laughed bitterly at himself. Like betrayal has a grace period. That line nearly broke my heart, not because it excused him, because it was the first intelligent thing he had said about the situation. I folded my hands in my lap. Why are you here, Ryan? He did not hide behind vagueness this time. To say I'm sorry. The words hung there between us. I believed that he meant them in the way broken people often do when reality finally reaches them. But belief is not the same as restoration. I am sorry, he said again, for the house, for the lies, for letting Jessica talk to you that way, for all of it. The wind lifted slightly. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I took a breath and said the hardest true thing I had learned in the aftermath of everything. I hear your apology. His shoulders sagged, either from relief or pain, I could not tell which. But I went on. That doesn't mean I can trust you. His face tightened. And there it was. The part so many people want to skip. They want forgiveness to feel like erasure. They want apology to open a door back into the room they burned down. Life is not that tidy. I'm not asking you to forget, he said quietly. No, I replied, but part of you is hoping I'll hurry. He looked away. I let the silence sit because some truths should be allowed to land without being softened. Then I said, if there is any future for us, Ryan, it won't be built today. It won't be built because you cried on my porch, or because Jessica left, or because losing the house taught you what my pain could not. It will be built, if it's built at all, by truth over time. Consistency. Humility. No demands. He nodded slowly, eyes wet now. I understand. I wasn't sure he did. Not fully, but he understood more than he had. And that, for the first time in a long time, was enough. When he left an hour later, he hugged me only because I allowed it, not tightly, not theatrically, just briefly, carefully, like someone holding something fragile he had once treated as unbreakable. After his car disappeared down the lane, I went back to the porch and sat for a long time in the fading afternoon light. I was not healed all at once. That is not how it works. But something important had happened that day. My son had come back not to reclaim comfort, but to stand in the consequence of what he had done. And I had met him there, without collapsing, without raging, without surrendering the boundaries that had saved me. For the first time, I understood that healing after betrayal is not about becoming soft again. It is about becoming whole enough that softness is finally a choice. There is a difference between a house and a home, and I did not fully understand it until I lost one and refused to lose myself with it. By spring, the cottage had begun to feel less like a place I had escaped to and more like a life I had chosen. The rosemary on the porch had grown thick and fragrant. The little bookshelf in the living room was full now. Some of my old books, a few borrowed from June, 2 mysteries, Lorraine insisted I would enjoy, and Daniel's worn history volume, the one Jessica once tossed into a donation box, as if memory were just another object waiting to be sorted out of. Sight. On Saturday morning, sunlight came through the kitchen window in a long, soft band and landed across the table where I paid bills, wrote grocery lists, and sometimes simply sat with a second cup of coffee and listened to birds in the trees. No one told me I was in the way. No one rearranged my things while calling it efficiency. No one translated my grief into a management problem. That, I learned, is part of what home means. Not luxury, not square footage, not ownership on paper alone. Home is where your humanity is not negotiated. For a long time after the sale, I kept waiting to feel the old ache differently. I thought maybe one morning I would wake up and realize I had moved beyond what Ryan and Jessica had done. But healing did not arrive as forgetting. It arrived as proportion. Their betrayal no longer defined the whole shape of my life. It became one chapter, a painful one, yes, a humiliating one, but not the last word. That mattered to me more than I can say. Because after a certain age, people begin making assumptions about women like me. Widows. Mothers whose children are grown. Women with silver hair, soft voices, old photographs, church routines, sensible shoes. They assume our stories are winding down. They assume our loneliness can be managed, our boundaries softened, our assets organized, our place in the family negotiated according to someone else's convenience. What I learned, what I had to learn the hard way, is that dignity does not age out. It may bend under grief. It may go quiet for a while. It may mistake love for safety and silence for peace. But if it is real, it does not die. And once it wakes up, it has a power that surprises everyone, sometimes even the woman herself. Ryan began visiting more regularly after that first day on my porch. Not every week. Not in some sentimental flood of redemption. Life is messier than that. But he came often enough that I began to notice the difference between guilt and effort. He stopped arriving with explanations. Stopped hinting for quick forgiveness, stopped trying to frame his pain as a bridge back into my trust. Instead, he did something much harder and much rarer. He became consistent. He fixed the loose porch rail one Saturday without turning it into a symbolic act. He brought groceries once when I had a bad cold, then left them at the door when I said I wanted to rest. He called on Sundays some weeks just to ask how I was and actually listened to the answer. When he spoke about the past, he did so without defending himself. When he apologized, he did not demand relief from the weight of it. That was how I knew he might truly be changing. Not because he suffered. Suffering alone does not improve character. Sometimes it only makes people more dramatic. No, what changed him, if indeed he has changed in the lasting way, I hope was the slow acceptance that love does not restore access by itself. Trust is built with repetition, decency, time, humility. The very things he once thought could be skipped because I was his mother and would surely understand. I do still love my son. That is one of the hardest truths to explain to people who have not lived through this kind of betrayal. They imagine love and anger cancel each other out. They do not. Love remains. Sometimes painfully. But love, I have learned, is not the same thing as permission. I can love Ryan and still remember exactly who he became in that house. I can care about his future and still refuse to rewrite the past to make him more comfortable. I can open a small door to reconciliation and still keep the lock. That too is part of healing. Jessica never contacted me again. Not directly. I heard through others that she tried to revive the boutique under a different model, that she moved twice in less than 6 months, that she told some people I had overreacted, and others that the whole thing had been financially biases. Complicated. I suppose everyone has to narrate themselves somehow in order to keep sleeping at night. For a while, I thought I wanted to hear more, to know whether she regretted anything, whether losing the house had taught her the same lesson it taught Ryan. But eventually I realized that curiosity was just another thread tying me to a life I had already fought to leave. So I let it go, not because she deserved grace from me, because I deserved peace from her. Sometimes women are taught that closure comes from one final confrontation, one final speech, one final chance to explain our pain so clearly that the people who caused it can no longer deny what they did. But age has given me a less dramatic and more useful wisdom. Closure often comes from no longer needing the person who hurt you to agree with your version of events. I know what happened. I lived it. That is enough. By early summer, my life had grown roots again. I hosted 2 women from the widow's circle for iced tea on the porch. I planted tomatoes in pots along the back fence. I started volunteering twice a month at a church clothing pantry where I met women in every stage of loss and reinvention. Some abandoned, some divorced, some recently widowed, some simply tired of being spoken over in their own homes. I never told my whole story all at once, but pieces of it came out here and there, and I noticed something each time. Women understood immediately. Not just the facts, the feeling, the subtle humiliations, the way dependence can be manufactured, the way kindness can be mistaken for weakness, the way family can sometimes reach for your resources before it reaches for your hand. And every time I saw that recognition in another woman's face, I understood more deeply why telling the truth matters. Not because it punishes the guilty, but because it frees the person who has been made to feel unreasonable for seeing clearly. If I had one regret, it was not selling the house. It was how long I kept trying to earn respect from people who had already decided to translate my love into leverage. But regret, like grief, becomes more bearable when it is put to work. So I let it teach me. I taught myself to review every document that crosses my path, to keep copies, to ask questions, to never confuse family language with legal protection, to notice when help starts sounding like control, to trust discomfort sooner, to believe that my age does not make me less entitled to safety, privacy, ownership, or truth. Most of all, I taught myself this: being a good mother does not require disappearing. That sentence might be the true ending of my story. Not the sale, not the confrontation, not even Ryan standing on my porch and finally admitting what he had done. The true ending is this: I did not let motherhood become the excuse for my own erasure. For too long, I think many of us were taught that love meant endurance without limit, sacrifice without boundary, understanding without reciprocity. We were praised for being easy to lean on, slow to anger, quick to forgive, willing to make room no matter how little room was left for us. But there comes a moment in a woman's life when she has to ask herself a harder question than, who needs me? She has to ask, who am I when I stop letting people use that answer against me? I know now. I am Bonnie Peterson. I am a widow, yes. A mother, yes. A woman who trusted too long, yes. But I am also a woman who learned, a woman who stood up before the last piece of herself was negotiated away. A woman who sold the house rather than let the people inside it bury her alive, in politeness, pity, and paperwork. And in the end, that choice was never really about revenge. It was about refusal. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to be managed. Refusal to be told that age should make me grateful for scraps of respect in a home built partly from my own sacrifice. At this stage of my life, I know something now with absolute certainty. Dignity is not a luxury. It is the minimum. And if love asks you to live without it, then what you are being offered is not love at all. It is surrender. I chose otherwise. And that is why, even after everything, I can sit on my little porch in the evening light, hear the wind move through the trees, and know that I did not lose my home. I found it. What this story taught me is something I wish more women learned before life forced it on them. Love is not supposed to cost you your dignity. So many of us were raised to believe that being a good wife, a good mother, or a good grandmother meant sacrificing first, understanding always, and enduring quietly. We were taught to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to excuse disrespect when it came from family, and to confuse self-erasure with devotion. But there is a difference between kindness and surrender. There is a difference between generosity and being used. And there is a difference between opening your heart and handing someone the right to diminish you. Growing older does not make your voice less valuable. Grief does not make you weak. Loneliness does not mean you should accept whatever treatment is offered just to avoid being alone. If anything, the later seasons of life should remind us that our peace is precious. Our time is precious. Our self-respect is precious. And anyone who truly loves us will never ask us to trade those things for a seat at the table. What moved me most in this journey was not the revenge and not even the justice. It was the awakening. It was the moment a woman who had been underestimated remembered that she still had worth, still had wisdom, still had choices, and still had the right to protect herself. Sometimes healing does not begin when others apologize. Sometimes it begins when you finally stop waiting for them to become who you needed them to be. Sometimes strength looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground. But either way, it begins the moment you decide that your soul is not negotiable. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what stayed with you most. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? I would truly love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy heartfelt family drama stories with powerful life lessons, please subscribe to the channel and join me for the next story.